Welcome back, friends. If you are curled up somewhere comfortable right now, blanket pulled up, lights low, the rest of the world finally quiet, then you have found exactly the right place to be tonight. I want to take you somewhere unexpected, not to a palace, not to a battlefield, not to the chambers of a king deciding the fate of nations. Tonight we're going to a small stone building on a narrow street in a medieval English town sometime around the year 1250, and we're going to meet the most important person in that entire town. Not the lord, not the bishop, not the knight clattering around on horseback in his expensive armour, like he owns the place, which technically he does, but still. No, the most important person in that town was waking up right now, in the pitch dark. Before the sun, before the roosters, before any reasonable human being had any business being awake at all. It was the baker, and here is what I need you to understand before we go any further, because this is the thing that is going to pull you through this entire series. The life of a medieval baker was nothing like what you are picturing in your head right now. Nothing like the cozy little shop with warm loaves in the window. Nothing like a cheerful man dusted in flour whistling to himself on a sunny morning. It was brutal work. It was dangerous work. It was legally treacherous in ways that are genuinely astonishing. And it was threaded through with moments of human dignity and quiet heroism that history for the most part completely forgot to write down. But we are going to find them. Did you know that in 14th century London, bakers were sometimes dragged through the streets on a sled, the offending loaf of bread tied around their necks, as official punishment for selling something that was just slightly too light? Did you know that the king himself had the legal right to walk into your bakery during a famine, take every loaf you had baked that morning, and hand them out to the crowd at whatever price he decided you were owed? And did you know that one of the phrases you probably use completely without thinking, something almost every English speaker says, was born in a medieval bakery from the charred and unwanted piece of a loaf that nobody with any social standing would ever agree to eat? We are going to get to all of it. Every last piece. But before we go any further, if this kind of storytelling is your thing, if falling asleep to real history with real stakes sounds like exactly what your nights have been missing, take just a moment. Like this video, subscribe if you have not already, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Are you in bed, on your couch, somewhere completely unexpected? I want to know. These little notes from you genuinely make this whole thing feel alive. Now, soften those lights a little more, let the room settle. Because we are stepping into a world where the sound of someone moving quietly in the dark well past midnight meant something specific to every person within earshot. It meant today we eat. Picture a town, England, somewhere in the middle of the 13th century. It is not large, maybe 2,000 souls crowded into a tangle of unpaved streets. Wooden buildings leaning toward each other across narrow gaps, the smell of animals and wood smoke woven into everything. There's a market square at the centre, a church whose bell tower you can see from the barley fields a mile outside the walls, and somewhere in the middle of it all, slightly apart from the closest buildings, always slightly apart, for reasons that will become clear, a low stone structure with walls thick enough to put your whole fist into the mortar. It is well past midnight. The town is dark in a way that modern people almost never experience. Not dim, not shadowy. Dark. The kind of darkness where you hold your hand in front of your face and genuinely cannot make out your own fingers, and in that darkness a man gets up. No alarm, no clock, no phone buzzing on a nightstand. Just the internal calibration of a body that has woken at this hour every single day for 20 years and simply knows when it is time. He might have been named Thomas or William. Robert was very popular. Medieval England was not, shall we say, breaking new ground in the area of baby names. He is the town baker, and what happens in the next several hours, the labour he is about to perform, the judgment calls he will make by instinct. The invisible calculations running constantly behind his eyes will determine whether the 2,000 people waking up around him in a few hours will eat that day. No pressure. The first task of every single morning was not flour, it was not dough, it was fire. And this is where the romantic version of medieval baking falls apart almost immediately, because that oven, the heart of the whole operation, was nothing like anything in your kitchen. Imagine a stone chamber. Thick walls, curved ceiling, deep enough that you had to lean in with a long wooden paddle to reach the back. The floor was stone smooth and dark from years of use. The whole structure sat low, almost like a small cave built into the side of the building, and when it was cold it was just a cave, inert, slightly damp, smelling of old ash. To turn it into something that could bake bread, you had to build a fire inside it. Not outside, not beside it. Inside it. Bundles of dry wood faggots, they were called, were pushed into the chamber and lit. And then the baker waited while the stone absorbed the heat. Slowly, steadily, the walls of the oven shifted from cold grey to warm amber, the temperature climbing by degrees that only experience could read. This process, just heating the oven, could take 2 to 3 hours before a single loaf went in. And here is the part that genuinely gets to me. There was no thermometer, no gauge, no little digital display reading 650 degrees Fahrenheit. The baker tested the temperature the way his master had taught him, and his master's master before that, in a chain of knowledge passed hand to hand across generations. He might hold his palm near the opening and count silently carefully how many seconds before the heat became unbearable. He might throw a small pinch of flour onto the oven floor and watch. Did it brown slowly? Did it catch immediately? Did it turn black in the time it took him to blink? He might look at the colour of the stone at the back of the chamber, the way a skilled painter reads the quality of light. Too hot and the crust would scorch while the centre stayed raw. Too cool and the dough would sit there deflating slowly, sadly into something dense and grey that nobody was going to thank him for. The margin for error was narrow. The consequences of getting it wrong, as we will explore in graphic and wonderful detail later in this series, were severe enough to make a grown man reconsider his career choices. While the oven worked its slow transformation, the dough was already moving. And let us pause here, because the leavening question alone is enough to keep a food historian happy for an entire afternoon. Medieval bakers did not have packets of instant yeast. What they had, what most relied on, was something alive, a culture. Often it was barm, the foamy, yeasty substance skimmed from the surface of fermenting ale. Sometimes it was a piece of raw dough saved from the previous day's batch kept in a cool corner, still bubbling, faintly still hungry, still doing what living things do when you feed them. We call this sourdough now. We act like it is a discovery, like someone in San Francisco in 2015 figured something out that the ancients had lost. The medieval baker would find this deeply funny if he were around to hear about it. That culture needed tending. It was in a very real sense alive, and if you neglected it, if you let the temperature drop too far or forgot to feed it, it would die. And then you had a problem that no amount of effort on the morning of could fix. The dough itself, once the flour, water, salt and leavening were brought together, required kneading. Long, sustained, physically demanding kneading. The kind that builds the structure in the dough develops. The gluten creates the elastic network that will catch the bubbles from the yeast and hold them as the loaf rises. This was not relaxing. This was work that built the forearms and the shoulders over years. A medieval baker's body was shaped by his craft the same way a rower's is shaped by the water. You could identify one by silhouette from across a room. In some of the larger bakeries, apprentices handled the kneading. In smaller operations, a one-man shop serving a village of a few hundred, the baker did it himself in the dark, in the cold, by feel. Which brings us to the apprentices. And they deserve a moment because the system that produced these young men tells us something profound about how seriously the medieval world regarded this work. You did not become a baker in a medieval town by deciding to become a baker. You entered an apprenticeship, and that apprenticeship lasted 7 years. 7 years. You would have started somewhere between 10 and 15 years old, a boy still growing, still forming, moving into the master baker's household, sleeping there, eating there, subject to his authority and his instruction in a way that is genuinely foreign to modern sensibilities. The arrangement was written down, formalized in an indenture, a legal document binding both parties. The master baker accepted responsibility not just for teaching the craft, but for the boy's general conduct and moral character, and the boy accepted in exchange for food and shelter and 7 years of education that he was essentially going to spend a significant portion of his adolescence cleaning ash out of a very hot oven before he got to do anything interesting. A fraternity of bakers existed in London as early as 1155. We know this because there are records of their payments to the Royal Treasury tax records essentially, which is how so much of medieval life survived. Nobody archived the ordinary moments, but money left a paper trail. By the time an apprentice reached the end of his 7 years, he had to present his work for judgment. A masterpiece quite literally demonstrated to the senior members of the guild that he had mastered what the craft required. Only then could he move forward, and even then he might spend years as a journeyman, a word that deserves to be unpacked because it is lovely. It comes from the French journey meaning a day. A journeyman was paid by the day's work 1 day at a time, not yet established enough to command a year's wage from a single employer. He travelled. He worked in other bakers' shops. He built his reputation the slow way, town by town, loaf by loaf, until the day he had enough experience, enough standing, and enough money to light his own oven. But let us come back to our baker on that dark street. By 3 or 4 in the morning, the calculus of the oven had been solved. The heat was right, he could feel it in his chest when he leaned toward the opening, that wall of warmth that told him what he needed to know. The loaves were shaped. And here is where the variety becomes extraordinary, because this is not a bakery producing one type of bread. He has made loaves of different sizes, different flours, different purposes. Round ones destined for households in the better part of town, denser, darker loaves for families who could not afford the fine wheat, small rolls, items on order for specific households, possibly the dense flat bread that would end up on tables not as food but as a plate, what was called a trencher. And yes, we will get to that because the trencher is a whole story by itself. Each loaf goes in on the paddle, placed with practiced efficiency from back to front, filling the chamber. The door is sealed, and the baker waits again in that particular kind of waiting that is not rest but vigilance, monitoring the smells, noting the changes in the air, the yeast smell giving way to the grain smell, giving way to that specific warm crust sweetness that means things are going correctly. Outside, the town is starting to shift. The very first light, not sunrise, just the loosening of complete darkness into something slightly less absolute, is beginning to appear, and with it the first sounds, someone drawing water, a dog making up its mind about something, a cart on cobblestones somewhere distant, and then the smell. Fresh bread moving through the cold air of a medieval street at dawn reaches something genuinely ancient in the human nervous system. Before you are fully awake, before you have formed a conscious thought, the nose catches it, and the body responds a warmth in the chest, a loosening of something tight, a basic animal recognition that nourishment is near. For the people in that town it was more than pleasant. It was reassurance. It was the baker's daily promise kept. Here is what I want you to hold on to from tonight before we go any further. Bread in the medieval world was not one item on a long list of things people ate. It was the list. Historians who have studied the diets of ordinary medieval English people have estimated that somewhere between 50 and 80% of their daily calories came from bread and grain, not as a supplement, not as a side, as the thing that stood between them and hunger, day after day, year after year. The average person in a medieval English town ate roughly 2 pounds of bread every single day. Do the math on a town of 2,000 people. That is 4,000 pounds of bread required every morning without exception, regardless of weather, regardless of harvest, regardless of the baker's personal circumstances, health, or the state of his oven. The baker was not a tradesman operating a small shop. He was functionally the food supply. The walls of the town kept out invaders. The well provided water. And the baker provided the one thing that could not be improvised or delayed the daily bread that made it possible for everyone else to do their jobs. And this social position, this combination of indispensability and visibility of power and accountability, created a life that was in ways both wonderful and genuinely terrifying, unlike any other trade in the medieval town. Because by the time those customers began appearing at the door in the early morning light, servants from the wealthy households first, then the ordinary townspeople carrying their baskets and their coins and their very vocal opinions about whether this loaf was quite up to yesterday's standard, the baker was already calculating. How much did he have? How many people were coming? Was the weight right? Was the colour right? Was today going to be a good day? Or was today going to be the kind of day that ended with someone reporting him to the guild the town was watching? The town was always watching. And next we're going into the belly of that oven, the ancient science of fire and stone that every great medieval baker had to master completely, or pay a price that would make your eyes water. Because the remarkable part, the part they never teach you in any history class, was not the baking itself. It was what happened in the hours before the first flame was lit. Stay with me. There is a concept in traditional bread baking that very few people outside of the craft have ever heard of. It is called a falling oven. And once you understand what it means, once you truly grasp the physics of it, you start to realize that every single loaf of bread a medieval baker ever produced was the result of a race against time that he could never win and could only manage. Let me explain. When a medieval baker fired up that great stone chamber in the pre-dawn hours, he was not creating a stable environment. He was capturing a moment. The fire burned inside the oven itself, not beneath it, not beside it inside it, heating those thick walls, those stone or brick surfaces to a temperature that could climb well past 500 degrees Fahrenheit at its peak. And then once the walls were saturated with heat, he swept out every last ember and every last trace of ash as quickly as he could. He sealed the opening, and from that moment forward the oven started to die. Slowly, steadily, irreversibly. The air inside was being heated by the walls as they radiated outward, releasing what they had stored. But the walls were cooling minute by minute, and every loaf that went in absorbed a little more of that dwindling warmth. This is what bakers mean by a falling oven. An oven whose temperature is always dropping, and where your job is to work in perfect sequence with the curve you cannot see, cannot measure, and cannot stop. The first loaves went in at the hottest moment. Those needed the highest heat, the crackling rapid spring that turns a ball of dough into a tall golden-crusted loaf in the span of 40 minutes or less. If the temperature was right, the outside set quickly sealing in the steam, letting the interior expand in that beautiful burst bakers call oven spring. Then, as the oven cooled by degrees, different items followed in waves. Think about the choreography required. After the bread came the pies, which needed somewhat lower heat. Then, as the temperature fell further, the drying of biscuits or the slow warming of items left in on the residual heat that remained long after anything could actively bake. Some medieval bakers even rented out the tail end of their oven's heat, that slow dying warmth, to neighbours who wanted to dry herbs or warm dishes for the evening meal. Every degree of falling temperature was a resource. Nothing was wasted. There is something almost poetic about that when you think about it. A modern kitchen is a study in control thermostats, timers, precise settings. The medieval bakery was a study in reading. The baker did not control the oven. He understood it. He worked with its nature rather than against it, the way a sailor reads wind rather than fighting it. And he learned all of this not from a manual or a class. He learned it by standing next to someone who already knew it in the dark before the world was awake for 7 years. Now, can I ask you something? Have you ever been somewhere, a restaurant or a market, or maybe someone's home, and smelled real wood-fired bread? Not the grocery store kind. The kind that comes out of actual stone and actual fire. There is a quality to it that is almost alarming in its intensity. It hits you somewhere below conscious thought. It is the smell of the Maillard reaction, the chemical transformation that happens when the proteins and sugars on the surface of the dough meet extreme heat and caramelize into something that is neither grain nor fire, but somehow both. Medieval people did not have a name for this chemistry, but they had the same nervous systems we do, the same ancient wiring, and every morning when that smell moved down the street from the bakehouse, it carried with it a message that the human body recognized before the human mind got involved. It said, "We are safe today." Let us talk about the building itself for a moment, because it was not simply a shop. It was an engineering decision with serious civic implications. In medieval England and across most of Northern Europe, the bakehouse was deliberately separated from other structures, sometimes by a gap of open ground, sometimes by being positioned on the edge of a settlement, occasionally even outside the town walls entirely. This was not an accident of geography, it was policy, because fire inside a medieval town was not an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. Consider what these towns actually looked like. Wooden frames, wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs packed densely together on lanes so narrow that 2 people with loaded baskets could barely pass without turning sideways. A single spark on a thatch roof on a dry summer morning could and did consume entire neighbourhoods before anyone could organise a meaningful response. Medieval town chronicles are full of fire, Canterbury, Winchester, Gloucester. The records do not say a building burned. They say a street was lost or 200 houses were taken. Fire in a medieval town did not stay politely in one place, and the bakehouse, with its enormous stone oven burning continuously for hours every single night, was the most persistent and reliable source of high heat in the entire settlement. The solution, moving it away from the cluster of homes building its walls thick, positioning it where prevailing winds would carry sparks away from rooftops rather than toward them, was a calculated trade-off between the community's need for daily bread and its need not to burn to the ground. There is something quietly remarkable about this. Medieval town planning is often dismissed as haphazard, organic, chaotic, and in many ways it was. But the placement of the bakehouse tells a different story. It tells you that people understood the risks, weighed them seriously, and made deliberate choices about where to absorb the danger. The baker's oven was the town's most essential tool and its most constant hazard, contained at a careful distance, monitored and maintained with the same vigilance that modern communities apply to electrical substations or water treatment plants. Essential, kept nearby but not too near. The oven itself was an investment of staggering proportion relative to the medieval economy. We do not have precise figures for what it cost to build a commercial baking oven in 13th century England. These things were rarely itemized in the surviving records the way land or livestock were. But we can piece it together. The materials alone, heavy stone or fired brick, quantities of sand and lime for mortar. The specialized clay lining for the interior represented more than most working families would see in a year. Then there was the skilled labor required to build it correctly. A mason who knew how to construct an oven that would hold heat efficiently, that would distribute it evenly across the floor, that would not crack under the thermal stress of repeated firings and coolings, that was not a generalist. That was someone with specific hard-won knowledge, and once built, the oven required constant maintenance. The thermal stress of daily heating and cooling worked on the masonry, the way water works on stone, slowly, relentlessly finding weaknesses and widening them. Cracks had to be identified early and repaired, or they would spread. The interior clay lining needed attention. The door had to seat properly to retain heat. To own a functional baking oven in a medieval town was to hold something of genuine capital value, an asset that could be leveraged, rented out, inherited, disputed in court. Historians of medieval England have noted that the ovens owned by feudal lords and monasteries were among the most carefully documented pieces of property in the manorial records precisely because they were so valuable. The great abbeys of England, Glastonbury, Ely, Westminster, maintained bakehouses that could produce bread for hundreds of people daily, and the records of their grain purchases, wood procurement and bread output survive in astonishing detail. When the guild records of London bakers from the 12th and 13th centuries mention members having their ovens destroyed as punishment for trade violations, that was not a casual threat. That was the medieval equivalent of having your entire business demolished. Not just your inventory, not just your license, the physical capital itself gone. That is how serious this was. Let me tell you something about the wood. Because the oven did not simply need fuel, it needed the right fuel. And procuring enough of it consistently across every week of every year was a logistical challenge that shaped the baker's life in ways that are easy to overlook. In a medieval town, wood was not freely available in unlimited quantities. Forests were managed, owned, controlled. The right to cut timber was a privilege tied to land tenure and manorial obligation, not something a town baker could simply exercise at will. He had to buy it arranged for its delivery store at somewhere dry enough to burn well, because wet wood burns poorly and produces more smoke than heat, which was a problem in an enclosed oven chamber where you needed clean combustion. The species of wood mattered too. Hardwoods like oak burned hotter and longer than softwoods and produced coals that held their heat. Oak and beech were prized, but they were also the woods that lords were most reluctant to see harvested from their managed forests. The baker often had to work with whatever he could get, supplementing with lighter wood and crop residues, calibrating each firing based on what the fuel could actually deliver. The bundles of wood used for baking the faggots were a common unit of trade and measurement in medieval markets. You could pay debts in faggots. You could rent the use of an oven for a fee denominated in faggots. The entire economy of heat production was woven into the broader economy of the town in ways that modern people, who pay a flat monthly rate for an unlimited and invisible energy supply, would find genuinely alien. Every morning the baker fed his oven. He was managing not just flour and dough and time and temperature, he was managing a supply chain. Here is something that France did differently, and it is worth mentioning because it reveals how central the oven was to the medieval understanding of power. In medieval France under the feudal system, the lord of a manor often held what were called banal rights, exclusive privileges over the essential tools of production within his territory. The mill, the wine press, the brewery, and above all the oven. The four banal, the communal oven owned and operated under the lord's authority, was not merely a convenience. It was a mechanism of control. Personal ovens in the homes of peasants and commoners were in many areas explicitly prohibited. If you wanted to bake bread, you brought your dough to the lord's oven operated by a designated oven master called a fournier, and you paid for the privilege in grain or coin. The logic on its surface was practical. The lord had built and maintained the oven, Someone had to recoup the cost. The fire risk argument was genuinely real and not entirely cynical. But the effect was to make bread the single most essential food in daily life, into something that passed through a choke point controlled by whoever held power over the land. If the Lord wanted to tighten his grip on a restive village, raising the oven fee or restricting access was one of the most direct levers available. England had a somewhat more diffuse version of this arrangement, with town bakers operating under guild oversight rather than strict seigneurial monopoly. But even there, the town authorities held considerable power over who could operate an oven and under what conditions. The oven was never just a cooking appliance. In the medieval world, it was a political object. One more thing before we move on, because I think it is the detail that stitches everything together. Remember the concept of the falling oven, that relentless drop in temperature as the morning progressed. Medieval bakers understood that if the oven had been properly heated, its walls could hold useful warmth for 6 to 8 hours or more after the initial fire went out. The sequence of what went in when was therefore not just a technical decision, it was an economic one. Every batch that followed the bread, the pies, the roasting, the drying, the warming, generated additional income from that single firing. Neighbours who had no oven of their own could bring their Sunday joints to the bakehouse on their way to church and collect them on the way home, cooked through in the slow-dying heat of an oven that had already earned its keep with the morning bread. This meant that a well-run medieval bakery was in modern terms a diversified operation. Not just a bread producer, but a shared cooking resource for the entire neighbourhood, with the oven at the centre of a web of small transactions that collectively made the difference between a business that survived and one that did not. The baker sold bread to live, but he rented his heat to thrive, and that distinction between the core service and the quiet accumulated income that surrounded it was something the best medieval bakers understood intuitively, long before anyone had words for concepts like revenue diversification or utilizing fixed assets. They had figured it out, in the dark before dawn by feel. There is so much more to this story, because so far we have been talking about the oven, the fire, the wood, the physics of falling heat. We have been inside the bakehouse in the hours when the town was still sleeping. But the baker's entire operation, his ability to light that oven every morning and produce what the town needed, depended on something that happened much earlier, much further away, and over which he had remarkably little control. The grain. Where it came from, how it got to him, what it cost, who controlled the mills that turned it into flour, and what happened when the harvest failed. That is where we are going next. And I will warn you now, it is more complicated, more contested, and honestly, more dramatic than you are probably expecting. Something that gets lost whenever we romanticize the medieval baker, and we do romanticize him because the image is just irresistible, is how far back the story actually starts. The loaf of bread sitting on that counter at dawn, warm and firm and smelling of everything good about being alive, it did not begin with dough. It did not begin with the fire. It did not even begin in the bakehouse. It began in a field months earlier in weather the baker could not predict and had no power to change. And between that field and his flour there was an entire chain of people and transactions and risks, each one capable of failing in its own particular way, any one of which could leave him standing at his oven in the dark with not enough of what he needed to do his job. The medieval baker was in the most literal sense only as good as his last supply delivery, and getting that supply right consistently affordably, in sufficient quantity at acceptable quality, was a problem he had to solve every single week of every single year for as long as he kept the doors open. Let us start at the very beginning of that chain. Wheat, rye, barley, oats. These were not interchangeable options on a menu, they were geographically specific realities, determined by soil type, climate and elevation, in ways that varied enormously across medieval England and Europe. Wheat was the premium grain. It had been since antiquity. Wheat contains a specific combination of proteins that, when worked with water, form the stretchy network gluten that allows bread to rise properly and hold its shape. No other grain does this with quite the same reliability. A well-made wheat loaf had a lightness to it, a fine crumb structure, a pale interior that read as luxury to medieval eyes, the same way white linen read as wealth in clothing. But wheat was also demanding. It needed reasonably good soil. It was sensitive to excessive moisture during harvest, to early frosts, to the wrong sequence of wet and dry. Across much of northern England, Wales and large swathes of continental Europe, wheat was simply not reliably cultivable. You could try, you might even succeed in a good year, but you could not count on it year after year the way you could count on rye. Rye was the survivor grain. Rye would grow in poor soil, in colder climates and conditions that would kill a wheat crop without hesitation. It was the grain of the northern and western regions, Scandinavia, Germany, Poland, much of France beyond the Paris Basin, Scotland, the upland regions of England. Rye bread was darker, denser, moister, with a slightly sour flavour that came from the particular yeasts and acids that fermented in rye flour. It lasted longer than wheat bread before going stale, which was genuinely useful in a world with no refrigeration. But it did not have the prestige. It fed you admirably, and people looked down on it for exactly that reason. Barley oats and various mixtures fell somewhere in between practical, nutritious, affordable, and carrying an invisible social label that everyone in the town could read at a glance. The baker then was not simply choosing what to bake. He was negotiating with geography. Grain did not arrive at the bakehouse as flour. This is the part of the process that modern people tend to skip over, because in our world the distance between field and flour is invisible, somewhere behind the scenes. In industrial silos and roller mills the transformation happens and we never think about it. In the medieval world it was a visible, costly, socially loaded step that involved a specific person, the miller. The miller occupied one of the stranger social positions in medieval life. He was essential as the baker himself, arguably more so since without milled flour the baker could not operate at all. And yet the miller was regarded across England and much of Europe with a particular and persistent suspicion that attached to no other trade in quite the same way. Geoffrey Chaucer, writing in the late 14th century, gave us a portrait of the Canterbury Tales miller that captures this reputation with gleeful precision. His miller was physically imposing, broad, powerful, a champion wrestler, with a wart bristling with red hair on the end of his nose. He was loud. He was crude. He played the bagpipes as he rode, which apparently everyone found extremely irritating, and crucially he stole. Chaucer's miller was described as a master hand at stealing grain, someone who could feel a customer's corn with his thumb, and know by touch exactly how much he could skim before the fraud became obvious. The phrase Chaucer was riffing on was already an old saying in his time: an honest miller has a golden thumb. The joke being, of course, that there was no such thing. This is not entirely fair to millers as a profession, but it is not entirely unfair either. Here is the structural problem. When a medieval baker or any person from wealthy merchant to humble householder brought grain to the miller ground it in exchange for a toll. A portion of the resulting flour kept as payment. This was standard, expected, and fundamentally unverifiable. How was the customer supposed to know exactly how much flour a given weight of grain should produce? How could they confirm the toll was precisely what was stipulated and not a handful more? The opacity was built in. The opportunity was constant. And the historical court records from medieval England are, to use an academic understatement, extensively populated with complaints about millers taking more than their due. Some of the methods were crude, others were impressively inventive. One case from the 16th century in Wales documented a gap deliberately left in the mill machinery, through which grain could be silently diverted into the miller's own sack, without it ever registering in the official toll calculation. Now here is what I find genuinely interesting about this, and I want you to sit with it for a moment. The baker was at the mercy of this person. He could buy grain from a merchant or a farmer, walk it to the mill, wait and receive back a quantity of flour that was essentially whatever the miller decided it was going to be, with very limited recourse if something felt off. He could complain to the guild. He could go to a different mill if there was one within reach. He could develop a relationship with a particular miller he had come to trust, and many bakers did exactly this, building long-term arrangements that were as much about predictability and reliability as they were about price. But the dependency was real. The vulnerability was real. The baker fed the town, and the miller fed the baker, and nobody, not the guild, not the king, not the law, could entirely solve the information problem at the heart of that relationship. Let us say the grain was good. Let us say the miller was honest, or at least honest enough. The flour arrives at the bakehouse, and here is where the baker's problems are only just beginning, because medieval flour was nothing like what you pull off a supermarket shelf. The quality of flour in this period varied in ways that are genuinely difficult to imagine from our current vantage point of absolute standardization. The stone grinding wheels of a medieval mill left grit in the flour, small particles of the millstone itself ground off during operation. A cheap mill or a badly maintained one produced flour with more grit. Over a lifetime of eating bread made from this flour, the grit wore down people's teeth in ways that archaeologists can still read in medieval skeletal remains. The enamel eroded the teeth, flattened the wear patterns unmistakable. The coarseness of the grind varied too. Fine sieving bolting, it was called, could separate out the bran and produce the pale, fine flour that wealthy customers expected in their white bread. But bolting was labour-intensive, and not every operation did it thoroughly. The baker had to work with what he had. There was also the matter of moisture. Flour stored in imperfect conditions absorbed humidity and went off. In a damp English winter in a stone building with earthen floors, and no humidity control whatsoever keeping flour dry enough to bake with properly, was a constant challenge. Flour that had absorbed too much moisture produced dense, heavy bread. Flour that had been kept too long developed off flavours that were impossible to fully mask. And then there was the darkest problem of all. I want to tell you about something called St. Anthony's fire. It has nothing to do with the actual St. Anthony, who was a 3rd century Egyptian monk famous for resisting temptations in the desert. The name came from the hospitals run by the Order of St. Anthony, founded in France in the year 1100, which specialized in treating patients with a particular constellation of terrifying symptoms. The illness began with burning sensations in the hands and feet, hence the fire. It progressed to convulsions, to hallucinations so vivid and strange that sufferers became convinced they were being consumed by invisible flames, or that insects were crawling beneath their skin, or that demons were physically present in the room. In severe cases, the restriction of blood flow to the extremities led to gangrene. Fingers and toes went black. Limbs fell off. In the year 994, a single outbreak in France killed between 20,000 and 40,000 people. The cause which nobody in the medieval world understood was a fungus. It was called ergot from the old French word for a rooster's spur because of the distinctive hooked shape it took when it infected rye grain. The fungus grew on the rye plant itself, replacing the grain with a dark, waxy, slightly curved body packed with alkaloids. These alkaloids, when consumed in bread made from infected rye flour, were the source of everything. The symptoms were real, the suffering was real, the deaths were real. And the baker, the person grinding that rye into dough every night, working with his hands in the flour, feeding it to the entire town, had no reliable way to know whether this particular batch of grain was clean or contaminated. Ergot-infected grain turned the rye dark and waxy. A careful baker in good light could sometimes spot the signs, but the ergot alkaloids were distributed throughout the flour once the grain was milled. If contaminated grain made it through the mill with the clean grain, the entire batch was compromised. And in years of bad harvest, when grain was scarce, and the pressure to use everything available was enormous, the threshold for accepting grain that looked slightly questionable was pushed lower and lower by simple desperation. There is a historian's phrase for what happened in these situations. The medieval poor ate what the year gave them. The baker baked what the flour allowed him to bake, and sometimes, not always, not even often, but with a statistical regularity that haunted the darkest years of the medieval grain supply. The bread that came out of that oven carried something invisible inside it that nobody intended and nobody could see. Now, the Great Famine. I want to spend a moment here because it illustrates with a clarity that no abstract description can match what it actually meant for a medieval baker to be dependent on the grain harvest. In the autumn of 1314 it began to rain across northern Europe, and then it kept raining, through the winter of 1314 into 1315. Through the spring, when the rain that should have given way to growing weather instead continued cold and relentless and ruinous. The crops that had been sown in autumn rotted in waterlogged soil before they could establish themselves. The spring planting was delayed, and then delayed further, and then compromised by conditions that were simply wrong for grain to do what grain needs to do. The harvest of 1315 was a catastrophe. Not a poor harvest, not a difficult year. A catastrophe in some regions, a reduction in yield of up to 70% compared to a normal year. And then 1316 arrived and it rained again. The price of wheat in England tells the story with brutal arithmetic. In 1313, a normal year, no particular drama, a quarter measure of wheat sold for 5 shillings. By early 1315, as the scale of the harvest failure became clear, that same quarter measure cost 20 shillings. By summer of 1315, as supplies dwindled, and the winter of 1316 loomed with nothing like enough reserves, it reached 40 shillings. 8 times the price of grain in the space of 2 years. Consider what that meant for the baker. His cost, the single largest input to his entire operation, had multiplied to a point that made the business model he had been running for his entire career essentially untenable. The price he was permitted to charge for bread was regulated by law. The amount he paid for the raw material had nothing to do with that regulation. The laws of supply and demand and the laws of the land were pointing in completely different directions, and the baker was the person standing in the middle. Chronicles from this period describe scenes that are almost impossible to fully absorb. The king himself, travelling with his household to the Abbey of St. Albans in August of 1315, expecting the traditional lavish hospitality that English monasteries extended to royalty, could barely be given enough bread to feed his entourage. The Archbishop of Canterbury sold holy relics to pay for food. In parts of Europe, people were recorded boiling horse carcasses to survive the winter. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by what historians have calculated to be over 800%. The baker who kept his oven lit through those years, who somehow sourced grain, however expensive, however questionable, however mixed with whatever inferior substitutes, the desperation of the times required, who maintained some version of his daily production, for the town that depended on him, that person was performing something closer to an act of civic heroism than most histories acknowledge. There is one more thing about flour that I cannot leave out because it is the detail that connects the abstract economic picture to something viscerally personal. When medieval bakers received their flour, they assessed it with their hands, not with instruments, not with laboratory tests. With their hands, their eyes, their noses, the full accumulated sensory intelligence of years of practice. You could feel the moisture content in flour by rubbing it between your fingers, whether it clumped too readily, whether it ran through cleanly, whether it had that slightly greasy texture that meant the grain had been stored in less than ideal conditions. You could smell the first hint of must or mildew, the subtle wrongness that distinguished grain starting to turn from grain at its peak. You could, if you had been at this long enough, form a reasonably reliable judgment about what the flour would do in the dough, whether it would take water readily or resist it, whether the resulting bread would have sufficient structure to hold its rise, whether the crust would colour properly in the oven. The knowledge lived in the hands. It was passed from master to apprentice, not in writing but in touch, in the physical act of showing someone else what you felt in the flour, and watching their hands until they felt it too. I think about that sometimes as someone who marvels at how casually we engage with the food supply we have been handed. All of that knowledge, that specific, physical, irreplaceable knowledge that lived in the hands of medieval bakers, most of it is gone. Not documented, not preserved, not transmitted, just gone. The bodies that carried it got old and tired, and the world moved on into different arrangements. And one day the last person who could tell whether a batch of rye had the particular weight and texture and smell of grain tainted with ergot was no longer there to tell anyone. What the baker knew, though, and what makes his position so fascinating the longer you look at it, was that the flour was only the beginning. Because once it arrived in his hands, once he had assessed it and accepted it, and begun the process of turning it into something the town could eat, a whole different set of pressures came into play. The town was not a single customer with a single need. The lord in his manor wanted one thing. The merchant's wife wanted another. The labourer who showed up at the door with his penny wanted something else entirely. And what each of them received, the type of bread, the colour of the crumb, the fineness of the flour it was made from, was not just a matter of personal preference. It was in medieval society a statement about who you were, and how that division worked, who got the white bread, who got the dark bread, who got the bread that was barely bread at all, is the part of this story that says more about the medieval world than perhaps anything else we have covered. That is exactly where we are headed next. Here is a question I want you to sit with for just a moment. Think about the last time you bought bread, maybe at a grocery store, maybe at a bakery, maybe somewhere in between. Did you think twice about which kind you picked up? Did you pause at the shelf and feel even for a second that your choice said something about who you were? Probably not. We live in a world where you can reach for the sourdough, or the whole wheat, or the brioche, and the only thing at stake is your personal preference and approximately $3 either way. In medieval England, it was nothing like that. In medieval England, the bread on your table was not a preference, it was a declaration. It was a visible, legible statement about your place in the social order, readable by everyone in the room, understood without a word being spoken, and enforced by custom economics, and in some cases by actual law. The baker knew this. He navigated it every single morning, and the system he was operating within was far more intricate and far more revealing about human nature than most of us have ever been taught. Let us start at the very top of the hierarchy and work our way down, because the view from the top is where you begin to understand why everything else existed in reaction to it. The finest bread in medieval England was called pain de main, a word borrowed from the French derived from the Latin panum dominicum, which translates with a satisfying directness as the Lord's bread. Think about that for a moment. The most prestigious food in the entire kingdom was not named after the way it tasted or where it came from, or the baker who made it. It was named after the category of person who was allowed to eat it. The Lord's bread. Pain de main was made from wheat flour that had been sifted, bolted 2 or 3 times to remove virtually all traces of bran and husk, producing a flour of such refined whiteness that the bread it made was almost luminous in a world where most food was brown and grey and dark. It was soft, it was light, it had a crumb so fine that tearing it felt completely different from tearing any other kind of bread. Historians believe a typical pain de main roll weighed around 200 grams small, precious, almost impossibly delicate by the standards of a culture in which most bread was dense and substantial. To make this bread required the best grain, the most careful milling, the most thorough sieving, and a baker with the skill to handle a dough so fine and so sensitive to temperature and timing that the margin for error was genuinely small. It was expensive in every dimension, labour, material, attention, and beneath it, in a descending hierarchy that medieval law actually codified in specific documents, came Westell, then Cocket, then the cleaner whole wheat loaves, then the brown and mixed grain varieties, then at the very bottom of the ladder, a rung so low it barely registered on the scale of human food, came something called horse bread. Horse bread. The name is not metaphorical. This bread was made from whatever grain and legume scraps were available: beans, peas, bran, oats, any combination of cheaper materials that could be pressed into a loaf-like form. It was primarily intended as a compact feed supplement for working horses, and medieval records note with a matter-of-factness that should stop you cold that horse bread was also consumed by the very poor, not occasionally, not in emergencies, but as a regular feature of their diet. Even in ordinary times, the distance between pain de main and horse bread was not just a culinary distance. It was the entire span of medieval society, from the lord in his hall receiving his precious white rolls to the labourer whose daily bread shared ingredients with the animals in the stable. The baker produced both, often in the same morning from the same oven for different customers who lived within walking distance of each other, but inhabited entirely different worlds. Now I want to introduce you to something that I think is one of the more quietly extraordinary facts in all of English linguistic history. The words lord and lady, two of the most enduring terms of authority and status in the English language, words that have carried the weight of centuries of social hierarchy that appear in the King James Bible and Shakespeare, and every formal address you've ever encountered, both come from bread. Specifically, they come from Anglo-Saxon. The word lord traces back to the Old English hlafword hlaf, meaning loafweird, meaning guardian or warden. Literally the guardian of the loaf, the person responsible for ensuring that the people under his protection had bread. The word lady traces back to hlafdig hlaf again, and a root related to kneading, literally the one who kneads the bread, the person who work the dough. Linguists have traced the evolution carefully. Hlafword contracted to hlaford, then somewhere in the later medieval period the F stopped being pronounced, the syllables blended and compressed, and it drifted through various forms until it arrived softened and transformed at lord. The word laird in Scotland preserves an earlier stage of that same evolution. The historian David Crystal, writing about this etymology, put it beautifully that the high-status meanings of Lord Master Prince Sovereign all have their origins in something as humble as bread, and I find this genuinely moving. Not in a sentimental way, but in the way you feel when you suddenly see a hidden structure in something you thought you understood. The English-speaking world organised its fundamental hierarchy of power and gender around bread. The man who controlled the supply was the lord. The woman who made it was the lady. Every time these words were spoken in courts, in churches, in legal documents, in poetry, they were carrying the ghost of a loaf at their centre. The baker who made the bread that lords dispensed and ladies prepared was the invisible foundation underneath the entire vocabulary of English social order. I want to come back to the hierarchy of bread types, though, because the middle of that spectrum is where life for most people actually happened, and it is more interesting than the extremes. Between the lord's pain de main and the labourer's horse bread, there was a vast middle ground occupied by bread that we do not have great English names for anymore, which is a shame because these loaves were the bread that the actual majority of medieval people ate every day and thought about constantly. Wastel was fine white bread, though not as fine as pain de main. Made from well-sifted wheat flour, it was the kind of bread that a prosperous merchant or a senior guild member might expect on his table. Not nobility, but comfortably above the middling sort. Wastel appears in medieval wills as a specific bequest. Charitable donors who wanted to ensure their generosity was meaningful would specify wastel bread for distribution to the poor on feast days, because even the poor understood what it meant to receive something that fine. The writer of Piers Plowman, a 14th century allegorical poem about English society, describes beggars who had grown accustomed to bread made with beans, now aspiring to eat wastel and cocket. The longing for white bread was not merely about taste. It was about what white bread meant. It was about the desire to be seen as someone who ate the way better people ate. Cocket was the standard white bread that a townsperson of ordinary means might buy, not the finest, but unambiguously white, reasonably well-sifted, made from decent wheat. In London, this was probably the bread most people thought of when they said they were buying bread. Records from the 13th and 14th centuries show cocket accounting for a significant share of what the town bakers were actually producing. And then there was maslin, that practical, honest mixture of wheat and rye that we encountered earlier as the grain of the majority. Maslin bread had a darker colour, a denser crumb, a slightly different flavour than pure wheat. It filled the stomach reliably and kept better in damp conditions than fine white bread, which grew stale quickly and was nearly useless after a day or two. The maslin eater was not ashamed of what he ate. He ate it because it was real, because it worked, because it kept him on his feet for a long day's labour. But he knew in the way that people who live inside social hierarchies always know exactly where his bread sat on the ladder and where he sat alongside it. Now here is where the baker's position becomes genuinely fascinating and a little uncomfortable to examine. He was functionally the person who maintained this hierarchy. Every morning he made decisions about flour quality, about sifting, about the careful gradations of effort and ingredient that separated one grade from another, that translated directly into who ate what. And those decisions were not made in a vacuum of pure economics. They were made within a social contract so dense and unspoken that it practically had the force of physics. The lord's household sent a servant to collect the pain de main. The servant knew not to accept something darker. The baker knew not to try to pass off something darker as pain de main. The transaction was governed not just by payment, but by shared social understanding, by the invisible rules that everyone in a small medieval town had absorbed simply by living within it from childhood. And here is what strikes me as quietly remarkable about this. The baker was probably the only person in that town who interacted in the same morning with every level of the hierarchy. The lord's servant came first, then the merchant's wife, then the guild members and tradespeople, then the ordinary households, then at the end perhaps someone who could afford very little standing at the door, with a few small coins hoping for whatever was left. The baker served them all. He knew all of them. He lived among them, and every interaction carried with it the encoded language of bread, what was offered, what was accepted, what was understood between seller and buyer, without a word being exchanged about what it meant. There is a poet somewhere who could do something beautiful with that. I am just the person telling the story. The trencher deserves its own moment here because it is perhaps the most vivid illustration of how bread functioned as a social object rather than merely as food. A trencher was not strictly speaking bread you ate in the ordinary sense. It was bread you ate off. The word comes from the old French tranchier, meaning to cut. And that is precisely what it was, a thick, flat slab cut from a stale loaf, typically 4 days old, hard enough to hold its shape under the weight of a meal, without disintegrating, and coarse enough to absorb the juices and sauces from whatever was placed on top. In a wealthy household, the trencher functioned as your plate. You received one at the beginning of a meal, the roasted meats and stewed dishes and pottages were served onto it, and you ate from its surface for the duration of the feast. When the meal was finished, the trencher by this point soaked through with the drippings and gravies of everything it had held was collected. And here is the thing that tells you everything about the medieval world's relationship with bread in a well-run household. Those used trenchers were given to the poor waiting outside the gates. The almoner, a specific household official whose entire role was the distribution of charity, would collect the trenchers, add any remaining broken food from the table, and carry it out to the people gathered at the manor gates who had nothing. The trencher was not a leftover. It was an institution. It was built into the architecture of how a wealthy household ate, with the knowledge that what could not be consumed inside would move outward to those who had nothing of their own. 4-day-old bread saturated with someone else's dinner. This was not cruelty, or at least it was not understood as cruelty. It was the system working as designed. The bread cycled from baker to lord to poor, and each stage of that cycle had its name and its custom and its understood dignity. What it tells us about inequality is a separate question, and not a comfortable one. There is a specific detail about the trencher system that most people do not know, and it connects back to something we touched on earlier when we talked about the oven. Remember the falling oven, the way baking happened in waves as the temperature dropped. The sequence of what went in first and what followed. Here is how that sequence played out in social terms. The finest bread, the pain de main, the wastel, went into the oven first at the highest temperature when the conditions were best and the baker's control was greatest. These loaves received the most careful handling, the cleanest flour, the most attentive timing. As the oven cooled, the darker, coarser breads followed. The maslin, the whole-grain loaves. The torta bread made from husk and flour, together dense and dark, the specific variety, most commonly used for trenchers. The very last items in the oven, the lowest temperature baking the most residual heat, were sometimes the most basic preparations of all. The horse bread, perhaps. The twice-baked biscuits intended for soldiers or long journeys. The falling oven was in its physical structure a map of medieval society. The heat at the top, the cold at the bottom, and the baker standing at the mouth of it with his paddle, placing each batch precisely where it belonged. In the cooling sequence, he was not just managing temperature. He was managing a world. Let me tell you one more thing about this hierarchy, because it contains a twist that I think the modern reader will find unexpectedly resonant. Medieval physicians, the educated men who wrote treatises on health and diet, who advised wealthy patients on what to eat, and why officially endorsed the hierarchy of bread. White bread, they declared, was easier to digest, more refined, more suitable for people of delicate constitution. The fine texture of pain de main made it appropriate for those who lived sedentary lives of mental labour, scholars, nobles, clergy. Dark bread, they said, was for people who worked with their bodies. The coarseness of rye and barley was appropriate for people who needed ballast, who spent their days in physical labour, whose digestions were stronger by necessity. This was, of course, almost completely backwards from what we now know nutritionally. Whole grain bread with its bran and fibre is genuinely more nutritious than highly refined white bread. The dark bread that medieval physicians assigned to peasants was metabolically speaking the healthier food. The white bread that the wealthy ate in their soft crumbling rolls, beautiful, prestigious, socially magnificent, was the nutritionally inferior product. The irony is almost too neat to be true, and yet it is documented across multiple medieval medical texts. The medieval social order managed to construct a hierarchy in which the poor ate the better food and were told by the very people at the top of the system that this was because their inferior digestions required it, and the baker produced both, made both, sold both. He probably knew better than anyone which loaf was actually worth more in terms of what it would do for the body that ate it. He worked with grain every day. He understood nourishment in the most direct, physical, tactile way imaginable. Whether that knowledge weighed on him is something the records cannot tell us. What the records do tell us, and this is where we are headed next, is that the baker's relationship with this entire hierarchy, with these fixed grades of bread and fixed prices and fixed weights and fixed expectations from every level of society, was governed by something that made it all legally explicit. There was a law, a specific binding royal law about bread in England, and it changed everything about how the baker operated. Not just the economics of his work, but the risks, the consequences, the particular species of anxiety that came from being the person responsible for feeding a town when the rules were enforced not with gentle suggestions but with public humiliation, financial ruin, and in some cases worse. That law and what it actually meant to live under it day after day, the pressure of it, the injustice of it, and the occasional inspired ingenuity people deployed to get around it, is exactly what we are going to explore next. 600 years, that is how long the assize of bread and ale remained in force as the governing law of bread production in England. From its formal codification under King Henry III, around 1266 through the reigns of more than 30 monarchs, through the Black Death and the Reformation, and the English Civil War and the Industrial Revolution, and Napoleon, the core principle of this law held. It was not significantly amended until the Bread Acts of 1822 and 1836. It was not formally repealed until 1863. A law about bread weight born in the medieval period governing English bakers until the reign of Queen Victoria. There is no other piece of food legislation in British history that comes close to that record. The assize of bread was not just a law, it was a foundational institution, arguably the single most persistent commercial regulation in the entire medieval and early modern world, and it shaped the daily existence of every baker in every English town for 6 centuries. If you have ever wondered why a baker's dozen is 13 instead of 12, the answer begins right here. So what exactly was this law? The logic at its centre was deceptively elegant, and it is worth spending a moment really understanding it, because once you see how it worked, you understand something important about how medieval governments thought about food fairness and the relationship between ordinary people and the economy they lived inside. The fundamental problem the assize was trying to solve was this: grain prices fluctuated constantly. A good harvest year could drop wheat prices dramatically. A wet summer, a failed crop, a disruption in trade, and prices could double or triple almost overnight. Meanwhile, ordinary people needed bread every single day, and they were working with fixed wages and fixed resources. They could not absorb wild swings in the price of their most essential food. What the medieval government decided, and this was genuinely sophisticated thinking for the period, was that the price of bread would not move. It would stay the same. A farthing loaf would always cost a farthing. A penny loaf would always cost a penny. But the size of that loaf would change with the grain market. When wheat was cheap and plentiful, your penny loaf was generous. When wheat was expensive, your penny loaf shrank. The price stayed fixed, the weight shifted, and every 6 pence added to the cost of a quarter measure of wheat. The prescribed weight of the farthing loaf fell by a specified amount. The whole thing was calculated on a sliding scale and published, proclaimed weekly in the marketplace by a local official whose job was to read out the current assize price, so every baker in the town knew exactly what weight to hit. Think about what this meant in practice. A baker operating under the assize could not simply raise his prices when his costs rose. He was legally prohibited from doing so. Instead, he was required to make smaller loaves. The consumer would walk home with less bread for their penny, but they would always know exactly what their penny would buy because the law made it legible. There would be no surprises, no price gouging, no baker deciding on a hungry morning that today his loaf cost twice what it did yesterday. For the ordinary consumer, The labourer, the widow, the apprentice, the housewife with a small fixed budget, this was protection. Real protection. The kind that mattered when bread was all that stood between your family and genuine hardship. For the baker, it was something else entirely. Here is the part that historians sometimes understate, perhaps because the economic complexity is a little dry on the surface, but which I find genuinely gripping once you sit with it. The baker's costs moved. Grain prices moved. Wood prices moved. The wages he paid his apprentices, or at least the food and lodging he owed them, had their own pressures. Everything on the input side of his operation fluctuated with the market, with the weather, with the 100 variables he could not control. His output price, the thing he was legally required to charge, did not move. This meant that the profitability of a medieval bakery was at its core a function of how accurately the government had calibrated the sliding scale. If the people setting the assize had done their arithmetic correctly and built in a sufficient margin for the baker's labour, and overhead he could survive. If they had not, or if conditions changed faster than the law could respond, he could find himself in a situation where the legal price of his bread was below his actual cost of production, with no legal avenue to raise it. The law was not entirely blind to this problem. The original assize included a provision specifying exactly what a baker was allowed to earn for each quarter measure of wheat. He used 4p plus the bran plus 2 small loaves as a kind of in-kind compensation for his servants, plus stipulated allowances for salt candles kneading wood and the fee for the sifting equipment. It was in its original conception an attempt to set a fair margin. Someone had actually sat down and tried to calculate the real costs of running a bakery and built them into the law. Whether those calculations stayed accurate across 6 centuries of changing labour costs and fuel prices and inflation is another matter entirely. The historical record suggests that the relationship between bakers and the assize was complicated at best and actively adversarial at worst. Which brings us to the cheating, which is where things get very interesting indeed. Have you ever heard the term baker's dozen 13 instead of 12? You have probably been told it comes from medieval bakers being generous. That is not quite the right framing. The more accurate story is considerably less charming and considerably more fascinating. Under the assize, a baker caught selling a loaf that was even slightly below the required weight faced serious consequences. Fines, public humiliation, and at worst the destruction of his oven. The measurements were done by officials with standardized scales. This was not a loose system. You could be tried in the manorial court for being 1/4 of a pound short on a wasteful loaf. The historical records of 13th and 14th century English towns contain entries exactly like this. Thomas Baker fined 4p for a farthing wasteful of low weight by 5 shillings. 5 shillings, that's 1/4 of a pound for a farthing loaf. Tried, recorded, fined. The problem was that bread baking is an inherently imprecise process. Dough absorbs moisture differently depending on the humidity of a particular morning. Ovens lose heat at slightly different rates depending on how much wood was used. A loaf baked for 40 minutes in a slightly cooler oven loses a little less moisture than one baked at the ideal temperature. There is no way with the technology of the medieval period to guarantee that every single loaf comes out at exactly the legal weight. Even with the best intentions in the world, small variations were unavoidable. The baker's solution was practical and ingenious in that specific way that people solve problems when the consequences of getting it wrong are severe enough. He added an extra loaf. When selling a dozen loaves to a middleman who would resell them in the market, the baker would include a 13th. This extra loaf was called the inbread or the vantage loaf. Its purpose was not generosity, its purpose was insurance. If the 12 loaves together came in slightly short of the aggregate weight requirement, the 13th covered the gap. And if they came in at the required weight anyway, the 13th was a small gift that kept the relationship smooth and the inspector's pen away from the record books. This is where baker's dozen comes from. Not from mathematical carelessness, not from simple generosity, from the calculated anxiety of people operating under a system where the cost of being a few grams short was high enough to warrant giving away an entire loaf as a hedge against disaster. Every time you hear the phrase baker's dozen today, and it has been in use in English since at least the late 16th century, you're speaking an echo of that medieval anxiety. A phrase coined from fear, now repurposed as a symbol of generosity. Language doing what language always does, carrying the ghost of its origin even as the meaning drifts. There is something I want to say about the assize that the historical accounts sometimes miss or at least do not dwell on. The law was on its face written to protect the consumer, and in important ways it genuinely did. Fixed bread prices in a period of volatile grain markets gave ordinary people something rare and valuable predictability. In a world where so much was uncertain, the weather, the harvest, the health of the livestock, the mood of the Lord, knowing exactly what your penny would buy when you walked to the bakery on a Tuesday morning was not a trivial thing. But there is an uncomfortable asymmetry buried in the structure of this law that becomes visible once you look carefully. When grain prices rose, the baker was required to shrink the loaf. He absorbed the cost squeeze by delivering less product at the same price. His margin could compress to almost nothing while he was legally prohibited from raising his prices to compensate. When grain prices fell, the baker was required to expand the loaf. The consumer got more bread for their penny. The entire mechanism was designed to stabilize the consumer's experience, using the baker's business as the shock absorber for whatever the grain market decided to do. In good years, the consumer benefited directly. In bad years, the consumer was protected from the worst of it, and the baker bore the economic pain of compliance. The baker, in other words, was positioned structurally between two powerful forces, the grain market on one side and the law on the other, with very little room to maneuver between them. He was essential to the smooth functioning of the system, and he was also the person the system was designed to squeeze when conditions became difficult. There is an argument that this is simply the nature of price-regulated industries, and medieval governments had reasonable justifications for operating this way. Bread was too important to leave entirely to market forces. The risk of price speculation in a staple food was real, and the consequences of bread becoming unaffordable for the poor were not merely economic. They were the stuff of civic breakdown, of the kind of popular anger that medieval governments deeply feared. But try telling that to the baker in a bad harvest year, standing at his oven in the dark, watching his wood supply dwindle, paying the market rate for grain that had tripled in price, and knowing that the law required him to sell his bread at the same price he charged when wheat was cheap. The assize was fair in aggregate over the long run across the whole cycle of good years and bad years. For any individual baker in any individual difficult year, it was something closer to a vice. One more dimension of this law deserves attention, because it illuminates how the assize functioned not just as an economic mechanism, but as a social contract between the town and the people who fed it. In the founding charter of the city of Winchester, written in 1203, more than 60 years before the national assize was formally codified, the rules for bread weight and price were written directly into the document establishing the city's existence, not added later, not legislated after the fact. Written in from the beginning as one of the basic promises the city made to everyone who would live and work within it. Good bread at a fair price was not a civic amenity in medieval thinking. It was a civic foundation, a condition of urban life as basic as the walls and the wells, and the baker operating under these rules, measured and inspected and fined and occasionally prosecuted, was not merely a businessman. He was a participant in a compact that the city had made with its own inhabitants. I find something genuinely moving in that, even as I acknowledge the ways the compact was imperfect and often unjust, There was at the root of it a recognition that the people who grew and milled and baked the daily bread of a town were doing something too important to be left entirely to individual negotiation. The community had a stake in what was on its own table, and the law was the community's attempt to articulate that stake in concrete, enforceable terms. The assize remained on the English statute books in some form from the 13th century to 1863. That is 600 years of more or less continuous enforcement across every kind of political upheaval England experienced in that period. Dynasties rose and fell. The church split. The country went to war with itself. The whole economic structure of society transformed from feudal to something unrecognizable. And through all of it, the law about bread weight stayed. There is persistence in that which I find remarkable. The world changed entirely around it, and the core principle that a loaf of bread sold in an English market had to weigh what the law said it weighed somehow survived everything until 1863, when a parliamentary act called the Statute Law Revision Act swept away a batch of old laws deemed obsolete, and the assize of bread was gone at last, only to be replaced eventually with other weight regulations. And in Britain, well into the early 21st century, loaves of bread were still legally required to weigh either 400 grams or 800 grams, a direct descendant of the same impulse that had governed Thomas Baker and his underweight Westale 7 centuries earlier. Some things, it turns out, take a very long time to actually end. The assize tells us something important about the baker's life that goes beyond economics. It tells us that his work was considered so consequential, so tied to the basic welfare of everyone around him, that the state was willing to invest centuries of institutional energy in regulating every aspect of it. The weight of the loaf, the quality of the flour, the price he could charge, the margin he was permitted to earn. No other trade was watched quite this closely. No other craftsman was scrutinized quite this specifically. That scrutiny was a form of recognition, even if it was an uncomfortable one. The baker mattered enough to regulate. He mattered enough to punish when he failed. He mattered enough to protect occasionally when the system put him in an impossible position. He mattered, in a word, the way infrastructure matters, and the people who were watching him most closely, who were willing to fine him 4 pence for a loaf that was 1/4 of a pound too light, were the same people we're going to meet next, because the assize gave the law its rules. But rules need enforcers, and the enforcers of bread law in medieval England were a specific class of people whose job was to walk into your bakehouse, pick up your loaves, put them on a scale, and decide whether what you had made that morning met the standard or did not. Who were they? How did they operate? And what happened when they found something they did not like? That is exactly where we are going from here. Let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about it for a moment. If you were trapped in a system where your costs moved freely, but your prices were frozen by law, where a bad harvest could drive your flour bill through the roof, while the government legally prohibited you from charging 1 extra penny more for the bread on your counter, what would you do? Most people sitting comfortably in their lives today would answer with something principled. They would follow the law. They would find efficiencies. They would talk to the authorities and try to get the regulations updated. Very reasonable answers, but we're not most people sitting comfortably. We're a medieval baker in a bad year in debt to the grain merchant with a family to feed, and an apprentice to house, and a guild inspector due on Thursday, and the legal weight for a penny loaf right now is something you cannot hit without losing money on every single sale. What actually happened, what the historical records of medieval London and Oxford and Southampton tell us actually happened, is considerably more creative and considerably more interesting. The simplest form of fraud was the most obvious underweight bread. A loaf that looked correct, smelled correct, sat on the shelf with the same confident shape as a proper loaf, but tipped the scale a few crucial shillings short of the legal requirement. There are surviving court records from 14th century English towns that read like a ledger of very specific embarrassments. Thomas Baker fined for a farthing wastel light by 5 shillings. Another baker fined for a second offence. A third one, whose name the scribe apparently could not spell consistently, appearing before the court 3 separate times in a single decade for the same violation. The repetition tells you something. It tells you that the fines, at least for first and second offences, were not catastrophic enough to prevent the behaviour from recurring. For a baker who had calculated that the margin between the legal price and the legal weight was genuinely unworkable in that particular season, accepting a fine might simply have been a cost of doing business. The inspectors, of course, were aware of this reasoning, and they adapted accordingly. The men tasked with enforcing bread regulations in medieval English towns went by various names depending on the century, and the town bread viewers, bread tasters, assay officers, but their function was consistent. They arrived unannounced if they were doing their jobs properly, with standardized scales and the authority of the guild and the manorial court behind them. A smart baker who heard they were coming had options. The most obvious was to keep the legal weight loaves visible on the counter and move the questionable ones somewhere less convenient to find. Back rooms covered baskets under the stairs. The inspectors knew this trick. They looked for it specifically. Some bakers reportedly tried mixing heavier substances into the dough. Chalk was relatively common. It was white, which meant it did not obviously alter the colour of wheat bread, and it added weight reliably. Sand and dirt appeared in the records too, less sophisticated, more desperate. The bread would not taste right, but if you were selling to customers who were buying quickly in a busy market and not examining each loaf at length, you might get away with it for a while. And then there were the iron bars. Medieval London's court records specifically document bakers who were caught inserting metal rods or bars into the centre of unbaked loaves. The iron sat at the core, hidden completely within the dough, when the bread was shaped invisible to any external inspection, adding weight that had nothing to do with bread. The loaf would go into the oven, bake around the metal, come out looking entirely normal. Nobody inspecting the crust would know. The bread examiner who found one of these had to cut the loaf open. I want you to sit with that image for a moment, a medieval bread inspector slicing open a suspicious loaf in a London bakehouse and finding an iron rod at its centre. That moment of discovery, the silence that must have followed the baker somewhere nearby knowing the game was up. It is one of the most vivid pieces of evidence we have about the pressure medieval bakers were under, and the length some of them went to when they felt they had no other option. An iron bar hidden in a loaf of bread. The ingenuity of desperation, but for sheer audacity, for the kind of elaborate, premeditated fraud that makes you want to simultaneously admire and shake your head at the human capacity for creative problem-solving under pressure. Nothing in the medieval bakery records quite matches what was discovered in London in the summer of 1327. The record of this case has survived in the city's documents, and the detail is extraordinary. A baker named John Brid was brought before the Mayor, Alderman and Sheriff of London on a charge of fraud against his neighbours and the common people of the city. The investigators had discovered something in his bakehouse. Built into the table where John Brid kneaded and shaped his dough, the moulding board as it was called, there was a concealed hole, positioned precisely beneath where customers would place their own dough when they came to use his oven. This hole led to a space below the table where a servant was stationed throughout the working day. The method was elegant in the most troubling possible way. When a neighbour or customer brought their shaped dough to be baked, which was entirely normal, as many households brought dough to the baker's oven and paid a small fee for the baking, they would place it on the moulding board as instructed. While their attention was elsewhere, the servant concealed below the table would reach up through the hidden hole and quietly remove a portion of the dough. Piecemeal, the record says, bit by bit. Over the course of a day, with a steady flow of customers, this accumulation added up to a considerable quantity of stolen dough, enough to bake into additional loaves that John Brid then sold as his own. The document notes that this was done skillfully and artfully. Those are the actual words used, to the great loss of all his neighbours and persons living near, and to the scandal and disgrace of the whole city. The language is formal and indignant. But underneath the legal prose, what you're reading is the record of an elaborate construction project. Someone had designed and built a functioning concealed mechanism into a kneading table, a trapdoor essentially sized precisely to allow a hand and arm to pass through, position to be directly below where customer dough would sit. This was not spontaneous. This was engineered. John Brid had commissioned someone to build him a sophisticated dough-stealing apparatus, hired a servant to operate it, and then run the whole scheme as a going concern until someone noticed. Now, and I say this carefully because I want to be clear about where I stand on this. The fraud was a genuine betrayal. The people being stolen from were ordinary families who had trusted a man in their community with something they could not easily afford to lose. Bread was survival. Stealing from the dough of someone who came to you in good faith, paying you for the fire in your oven, is a specific kind of violation. But when you line up all the methods, the underweight loaves, the chalk in the flour, the iron bars in the dough, the trapdoors under the kneading table, what you see is not a random collection of bad actors who happen to end up in the baking trade. You see a profession under sustained economic pressure, responding to that pressure with the tools available to it. The assize froze prices while costs moved freely. In difficult years, some bakers calculated that honest compliance was financially impossible and made a choice. Not always a noble choice, but a recognizably human one. William Langland, writing the great allegorical poem Piers Plowman in the 14th century, included bakers alongside brewers and butchers as people who poison the people secretly and often. The condemnation was severe, and Langland understood, as his whole poem makes clear, that these same people were the ones keeping the city alive. He held the judgment and the dependents together in the same hand because he had no other choice. Neither did the city. The punishments, when they arrived, were designed to be as public as the bread itself. For a first offence of selling underweight bread in London, a single violation, possibly an honest mistake, possibly not the standard punishment, was the hurdle. The baker would be placed on a wooden sled, the offending loaf tied around his neck and drawn through the city streets behind a horse, through the market, past the Guildhall, down the lanes where his customers lived and bought from him every morning. The purpose was not primarily physical suffering, though the jostling and exposure certainly involved that. The purpose was recognition. Every single person who saw him moving through those streets understood exactly what had happened and who this man had been. His customers would see him, his guild brothers, his apprentices, the Lord's servant, the neighbour who came to use his oven, the priest. All of them watching. You could not separate what this man had done from who he was in the eyes of this town. That was the design. A second offence brought the pillory. Head and hands locked in the wooden frame in a public place, unable to move, available to whatever the gathered crowd decided to offer. The crowd in a medieval market was not passive. Rotten vegetables thrown at close range from an arm's length away were not harmless. An hour in the pillory was a serious physical experience, not merely a symbolic one. A third offence brought the destruction of the oven, not a fine. The oven itself, the capital investment, the structure built from skilled masonry work, the asset that had taken years to accumulate, demolished, rubble, gone. The three-strike structure was intentional in what it communicated. A fine says you did wrong, pay us and continue. The pillory says you did wrong twice, and now your neighbours will be witnesses to your shame. The oven's destruction says something different and final. You have proven you cannot be trusted with this. The community is taking it away. There is a brutal coherence to it. The oven was the community's food supply, managed by one person on behalf of everyone. That trust had been broken 3 times. The solution was not more punishment, it was removal. The community simply excised the person from the role they had abused. Let me tell you one more thing before we move on, because the range of punishments across medieval Europe is genuinely illuminating about how universal this underlying principle was. In Vienna, the punishment for a baker caught selling underweight bread involved a device called the Bäckerschöpfen. This was a cage suspended above a river. The baker was placed in it and the cage was lowered into the water, several times, in front of a watching crowd. In Turkey, records describe the offending baker being stretched across his own kneading table for a specific punishment involving the soles of his feet. In ancient Egypt, some accounts suggest a repeat offending baker could be nailed by the ear to the door of his own shop and left there as his customers filed past to make their purchases. Every bread culture across every era that baked bread developed its own version of the same thing. The punishment for betraying the bread supply was public, physical, and unmistakable in its meaning. You cheated us, and everyone is going to know. Most medieval bakers, to be clear, did not cheat. The records document the failures because failures generate records. The honest baker who hit the legal weight every morning for 30 years left almost no trace in the documents we have inherited because there was nothing to write down. His bread was correct. He fed his town. The inspectors weighed his loaves and walked away. That is not a story that generates a court filing, but it is, when you think about it, the majority of the story. The fraud is vivid and memorable and tells us something real and important about the pressures of this life. The honest daily work, the competence, the reliability, the quiet professionalism of someone who simply did what the town needed done morning after morning, year after year, is harder to see precisely because it worked. The invisible success of a well-run medieval bakery is in some ways the most profound thing about the whole picture. The guild was supposed to be the institution that made that success possible. The structure that protected the honest baker helped the struggling one and dealt with the fraudulent one before the civic courts had to get involved. Whether it actually delivered on that promise, the politics of it, the rivalries within it, the ways it both protected and constrained the baker who belonged to it, is something we are going to look at carefully and up close in what comes next. Because the guild was not a benevolent institution, it was a human one, which means it was complicated, self-interested, occasionally unjust, and absolutely essential to anyone who needed it in the dark. The worshipful company of Bakers of London still exists today. Right now, in 2026, it maintains a hall in Harp Lane near Billingsgate, holds ceremonies, supports charitable causes, and carries its motto, "Praise God for all," as it has carried it for centuries. It elects a master. It meets formally. It is one of the livery companies of the City of London, ranking 19th in the official order of precedence among institutions whose histories stretch back to the medieval world, and its origins reach back to 1155. According to the pipe rolls of King Henry II, the royal financial records that are among the most valuable documents we have for understanding 12th century England, the Bakers of London, recorded in Latin as the Bolengari, were paying an annual fee to the king's treasury from that year onward, a mark of gold, per year, for the right to be recognised as a guild. Only the Weavers' Guild has a slightly earlier entry in those same records. The bakers based on this evidence can claim to be the second oldest recognised guild in London. Second oldest. Out of all the trades, all the crafts, all the organised professions that the medieval city produced, bread was too important for its makers to operate without structure. What is a guild at its root? The word itself comes from the Saxon gilden, to pay or to yield, which tells you something about the transactional foundation of the whole enterprise. You pay dues, and in exchange the guild does things for you that you could not do for yourself. But the medieval guild was considerably more than a dues-paying organisation. It was, depending on how you look at it, a professional association, a regulatory body, a social safety net, a mutual insurance scheme, a religious fraternity, and a political lobby operating simultaneously. At various points in its history, any one of these functions could become the most important. Which function dominated at any given moment depended on what the members needed most. For the baker, the most pressing needs were threefold. First, protection from the external forces, lords, tax collectors, foreign competitors who might otherwise squeeze him out of the market or extract more than was fair. Second, accountability within the profession itself, which sounds like a constraint but was actually in important ways a form of protection too. And third, a community of people who understood his particular life, who had stood at the same oven in the same pre-dawn dark, who knew exactly what the legal weight problem felt like from the inside, and who would in specific defined circumstances come to his aid. Let us take each of these in turn. The guild's first function, protection from outside pressure, was the reason it formed in the first place. Manorial lords, as we have established throughout this story, held enormous power over the economic lives of the people within their territory. The banal rights we discussed earlier, the monopoly over ovens, mills, and other essential productive equipment, gave lords a lever that they did not always use gently. The bakers of a medieval town operating individually with no collective voice were vulnerable to arbitrary fees, capricious enforcement, and the kind of exploitation that simply flows naturally from a situation of extreme power asymmetry. A guild changed the mathematics of that relationship. When the bakers of London paid their annual mark of gold to the royal treasury, they were not just paying for recognition, they were paying for status, for the right to say, we are an organised body with a formal relationship to the crown, and that relationship carries protections that an individual baker operating alone cannot claim. The guild gave its members a seat, however small, at the table of civic power. It made them visible to the authorities as a collective rather than as a scatter of isolated craftsmen. In practice, this meant the guild could negotiate on behalf of its members. It could petition the king or the city authorities when regulations became genuinely unworkable. It could represent the baker's position in the ongoing dispute between the interests of producers and the interests of consumers, a dispute that, as we have seen, was baked into the very structure of the assize and never fully resolved. The guild also defended its members' market position against outsiders. In London, the Bread Street Market was specifically organised to give preference to London bakers, forcing rural competitors who came into the city to sell at prices that made competition difficult. This was protectionism, clearly. It was also, from the members' perspective, the point. The accountability function is more complicated and more interesting. The guild's wardens, senior elected officers responsible for enforcement, had the right and the duty to inspect member bakers' bread. They could walk into any member's bakehouse, weigh the loaves, assess the quality of the flour. If the bread was not adequate, the records from Paris describe guild masters with the authority to confiscate everything in the window and everything still in the oven. Everything, not just the suspect loaf, everything. This power was not gentle. It was not designed to be. The guild was not primarily interested in compassion for the struggling baker. It was interested in the collective reputation of the trade. One member caught selling bad bread reflected on every member. The customer who was cheated by a dishonest baker did not simply distrust that baker. She distrusted bakers. And in a world where the baker's entire livelihood rested on the daily trust of the people who came to his counter, collective reputation was not an abstract concern. The guild self-policed partly because it had to, and partly because it understood something that individual members sometimes forgot. In a bad year, the reputation of the trade was the baker's most valuable asset, and it was held collectively or not at all. Now here is the moment where I want to be honest about the less flattering side of this accountability structure, because the guild was not always applying its standards evenly or fairly. The guild's wardens, the people making judgments about whose bread was adequate and whose was not, were themselves master bakers. They were members of the same professional community with their own interests, their own relationships, their own histories with the people they were inspecting. The system that was supposed to discipline cheating was operated by people who were embedded in the same network of friendships, rivalries, debts and alliances as the people being regulated. Was it enforced consistently? The historical record suggests not always. Who you knew within the guild, how long you'd been a member, what your standing was with the senior wardens, these things mattered in ways that were not officially acknowledged and almost never documented, but that shaped how the rules actually landed. This is not unique to medieval bakers. It is the nature of self-regulation in any industry. But it is worth naming because the guild's authority over its members was real and sometimes severe, and the question of who bore the brunt of that authority was not always answered by the straightforward application of the rules. The third function, community and mutual aid, is the one I find most moving, and the one that most directly shaped the baker's daily life. Because here is something that is easy to miss when we look at the guild primarily as a regulatory body. It was also the closest thing the medieval baker had to a safety net. There was no state welfare in medieval England. There was no unemployment insurance, no sickness benefit, no pension system, no mechanism by which a person who could no longer work could expect support from any institutional source beyond the church's general charity, which was distributed according to criteria that were not always consistent and often had nothing to do with how long you had worked or how faithfully you had contributed. The guild changed this within its membership in specific and meaningful ways. A baker who fell seriously ill, who could no longer stand at the oven, could no longer lift the paddle, could not meet the physical demands of a trade that had always required physical strength, could appeal to the guild. The specific arrangements varied by guild and by century, but the principle was consistent. Members in good standing who faced genuine hardship through no fault of their own could expect some form of assistance from the collective funds to which they had contributed throughout their working lives. The guild paid for members' funerals. This matters more than it might sound, because a funeral in the medieval period was not a small or cheap affair. It had religious significance, social significance, community significance. The idea that a man who'd spent his life feeding a town might be buried without proper ceremony was genuinely shameful in the medieval moral framework. The guild ensured that its members did not face that shame. The guild also in many cases provided for widows. A baker's widow, particularly if the couple had no adult sons capable of continuing the business, and if the woman herself did not have the training to take over the oven, was in a genuinely precarious position. She had the equipment possibly. She had the premises maybe. She had no income from a profession that required years of apprenticeship, and no obvious means of support in a world that did not yet have the employment infrastructure that might allow her to simply transition to another kind of work. Some guilds made specific provision for widows' financial support, housing assistance, the right to continue operating the bakery under certain conditions. The Bakers' Company almshouses, whose records include a site purchased in Hackney Road in 1828, were an institutional expression of a principle that had been operating informally for centuries before it was given that formal structure that the guild looked after its own. Now, the thing that is genuinely fascinating about the London Bakers' Guild, the thing that tells you this was a human institution and not an ideal one, is what happened in the early 14th century. They split. Not because of a philosophical dispute, not because of a governance crisis or a corruption scandal. They split because of bread. Specifically, they split over the question of white bread versus brown bread, as white wheat bread became increasingly popular, as the social prestige we discussed earlier drove demand toward the lighter, finer loaves. A tension developed within the single bakers' guild between those who specialized in white bread and those who specialized in the darker mixed grain varieties. The economics were different, the customer base was different, the regulatory pressures were different, because the assize focused primarily on white wheat bread and had relatively little to say about the brown loaves. And so sometime in the early years of the 14th century, the London bakers formally split into two distinct guilds, the white bakers and the brown bakers. Two separate brotherhoods, two separate sets of wardens, two separate systems of enforcement and mutual aid. Operating in the same city, baking in some cases on the same street, both claiming descent from the ancient fraternity that had been paying its annual mark of gold to the crown since 1155. The white bakers received their first royal charter from Henry VII in 1486, though some historians believe this merely formalized an arrangement that had been operating informally for much longer. The brown bakers eventually obtained their own coat of arms in 1572, their own charter in 1614, and even their own hall in Aldersgate in 1635. For 3 centuries, London had two bakers' guilds. The white bakers over time became the more powerful of the two, not because of better organization or superior conduct, but because white bread won. As demand for fine white loaves grew, and the social preference for lighter bread became more entrenched, the brown bakers' share of the market contracted. Their influence waned, their membership declined, and in 1645, after years of resistance and several failed attempts by the white bakers to force a reunion, the brown bakers finally agreed to merge back into the single company that has continued in various forms to the present day. 3 centuries of rivalry, ended by declining trade and the simple arithmetic of irrelevance. Pause here for a moment, because I think this split tells us something important about bread that we've been circling around throughout this story without quite landing on directly. The brown bakers were baking the more nutritious bread. We know this now with the benefit of modern nutritional science. Whole grain bread with its bran and fibre and complete wheat germ is significantly more nutritious than the refined white bread that the white bakers specialized in. The brown bakers were feeding the poor, certainly, but they were feeding them better food, and they lost. Not because of the quality of their product, not because of any failure of their craft. They lost because the market, the social preferences of a society that associated whiteness with refinement and darkness with coarseness, moved against them. The more prestigious guild, the guild whose bread the lords and merchants wanted, was the guild making the less nutritious food for social reasons dressed up as culinary ones. There is a lesson in this about the relationship between prestige and value that I leave to you to apply wherever you see fit in the modern world. You will not have to look far. Something else the guild did, which we have not yet touched on, is that it maintained a halimote, a meeting of all the members of the guild that took place at regular intervals. In London, in the early records, this was tied to the feast of the Nativity of St. John the Baptist in late June. All bakers were required to attend. Absence without a good reason resulted in a fine of 21 pence. 21 pence for missing a meeting, which tells you how seriously the guild took attendance. The halimote was not just administrative. It was the moment when the brotherhood became visible to itself, when the baker who spent his days largely in isolation working before dawn, with his flour and his oven, and perhaps 1 or 2 apprentices, was reminded that he was part of something larger. He sat in the same room as every other baker in the city. They knew each other's faces. They knew each other's reputations. They argued probably. They voted on things. They elected wardens. They contributed to the poor box. By 1486, the city authorities had streamlined the halimote's agenda to 3 core items, keeping the assize, preventing the forestalling of wheat, and the division between white and brown bread bakers. The elaborate meeting of all city bakers had been compressed into 3 bullet points on a civic checklist. The institution had survived by simplifying itself, which is again very human. Can I ask you something? Think about any professional community you belong to, or have belonged to: a team at work, a school, a church, a sports club, a neighborhood association. Have you ever experienced that specific tension between the institution that holds you together and the ways it can sometimes hold you back, between the protection it offers and the constraints it imposes? The medieval baker lived inside that tension every day. The guild was his best protection against a world that could crush an individual baker without pause or consequence. And the guild was also the institution that could pull down his oven on a third offence that could side with a senior warden against him in an inspection dispute that could make his life very difficult if he ran afoul of the wrong person at the wrong moment. It was not an institution designed for justice in the abstract. It was designed for collective survival in the specific. And collective survival sometimes requires sacrificing the individual, the member who cheated the baker, whose standards had slipped the journeyman who couldn't quite make the transition to master. The guild looked after its own, and it decided constantly and without appeal who counted as its own and who did not. What the guild could not solve, what no institution in medieval England could solve, was the problem we have been building toward throughout this entire story. The problem of the people who were doing the work but not getting the credit. The people who were present in the bakehouse before dawn, who knew the feel of the dough, who understood the oven's temperament, who managed the household, the supplies, the selling, the women, the female bakers, and there were more of them in more central roles than the official records of guilds and courts and royal statutes have ever fully acknowledged, are the subject we are turning to next. And their story is, I think, one of the most quietly extraordinary chapters in this whole history. Somewhere in England, sometime in the 13th century, a woman is standing at a counter. She is not behind the counter in the way that a modern shopkeeper stands behind a register. She's at the edge of the world, in the liminal space between the bakehouse and the street, where the bread that was made before dawn meets the people who need it before the working day begins. She is handling money. She is making decisions. She is reading her customers, managing inventory, negotiating prices in the small ways that never make it into the formal accounts, but that determine day by day whether this household survives or doesn't. Her husband is in the back room, or he's asleep after the night's labour, or he's dealing with the flour merchant. The bakery is her domain right now. And most of what she knew, most of what she did, most of the judgment and skill and accumulated experience she brought to that counter, none of it was ever written down under her name. This is the story we have not yet told. The historical erasure of women from the medieval trades is not a mystery. It follows a logic that is uncomfortable to articulate but easy to trace. Women's work was in the medieval framework assumed to be either domestic and therefore invisible, or auxiliary to a husband's enterprise and therefore credited to him. The records that survived guild registers, tax documents, court filings, manorial accounts were produced by institutions that organized themselves around male headship. When a woman appears in these records, she's usually there because something went wrong, or because she was legally forced into visibility by a death, a dispute, or a transaction that could not be attributed to a man, but she was there long before the record noticed her. The Anglo-Saxon tradition in England was in some ways more honest about this than later centuries would be. We have already established that the word lady derives from hlefdig, the one who kneads the bread. Not metaphorically, literally. In the early medieval period, bread-making was understood to be in secular households predominantly women's work. Women ground the grain. Women managed the fermentation cultures. Women shaped the loaves. The transformation of grain to bread was not understood as male labour. That women occasionally assisted with it, was understood as female labour that men occasionally moved into when it became commercially organised. This is a pattern that repeats across food history with uncomfortable consistency. When a domestic skill becomes a trade, when money starts to move through it, the records begin showing more men. The women who did the work before it was commercially interesting are retroactively obscured, while the men who formalised it into a profession occupy the surviving documentation. Brewing follows exactly this arc. The earliest English ale production was dominated by women. The alewife, the brewster, were familiar and common figures. As brewing moved from household production to commercial enterprise in the 13th and 14th centuries, men began to dominate the records. By the Tudor period, professional brewing was largely a male industry, and the women who had brewed ale for centuries had been gradually written out of the economic story. Baking followed a similar trajectory, though not quite as completely. The evidence that women were central to medieval bread production exists. You simply have to know where to look for it. In the Tarquinum Sanitatis, a remarkable illustrated manuscript on health and medicine, produced in northern Italy in the late 14th century, with French versions that became widely copied, there are multiple illustrations of bakers at work. And in these illustrations, the bakers are often women, filtering flour, kneading dough, handing finished loaves to customers across a counter, using the long-handled paddle to load and unload the oven, not assisting, doing. The manuscript is not a document about women's work specifically, it is a health manual. But the illustrators who depicted daily life as they knew it in the 14th century apparently found it entirely natural to depict the bread-making and bread-selling roles as occupied by women, because that was what they saw. In southern France, the records from Montpellier between approximately 1300 and 1460 show that 8.5% of hiring contracts in the baking trade were concluded by an independent female employer, a woman running her own business, taking on workers in her own name. Another 5.5% involved married couples with the wife explicitly sharing training responsibilities alongside the husband. These were not informal arrangements. They were formal contracts, recorded by notaries who had to use the feminine grammatical form of the word baker pistorissa, or pistrix in Latin because the employer was female. Those words exist in the historical record. Some medieval notary sat down and wrote pistorissa in an official document because the person he was writing about was a woman running a bakery, and the language required him to acknowledge it. In Bordeaux, from the 13th through the 15th century, records document women working simultaneously as bakers and as fournières, the operators of communal ovens, not assistants to fournières themselves. And then there is Jeannette Barral. I want to tell you about Jeannette Barral because she is one of those historical figures who deserves to be more widely known than she is, and who illustrates everything I am trying to convey about the gap between what the documentary record shows and what actually existed. Jeannette Barral was a baker in Marseille. We know this because of a contract that survives from the early 1340s, roughly around the year 1342, placing her at the height of the medieval commercial economy in a major Mediterranean port city. In this contract, Jeannette Barral entered into a formal business agreement with the Royal Navy of France. Not the royal household, not a local lord. The Navy. She contracted to supply 2,000 quintals of sea biscuits within 8 weeks. Sea biscuits or ship's biscuits. The heavily dried, twice-baked bread that provided the staple food for sailors on extended voyages were not a casual product. They required specific preparation. The bread had to be baked to remove almost all moisture, then dried further, in order to survive weeks or months aboard ship without developing mould. The production of 2,000 quintals in 8 weeks was a serious industrial undertaking. A quintal in 14th century measure was approximately 100 pounds. 2,000 quintals, therefore, was roughly 200,000 pounds of biscuit, the equivalent of something approaching 100 tons of product produced in less than 2 months. Jeanette Barral took that contract. She negotiated it. She presumably organised the labour to fulfil it. She had a business large enough and a reputation solid enough that the Royal Navy of France considered her a reliable supplier for military provisioning. We do not know what became of her after this contract. We do not know whether she fulfilled it on time, whether there were disputes, whether she went on to other contracts, or wound down her operation. The historical record gave her one brief extraordinary moment of visibility and then moved on. But in that one moment she is absolutely clear. A woman, a baker, a naval contractor. Now here is the part of this story that involves the law, and specifically the legal structure that shaped everything a woman could do or not do in medieval England, depending on whether she was married. The doctrine was called coverture. The word comes from the Old French meaning a covering, and it described with a kind of brutal elegance the legal status of a married woman under English common law. She was covered by her husband. She and her husband were in the law's understanding one single person, and that person was him. This meant, among other things, that a married woman could not make contracts in her own name. She could not own property independently. She could not sue or be sued as an individual legal entity. Any money she earned, any goods she acquired, any business she conducted, these technically belonged to her husband, who was her legal representative, her proxy, her cover. The practical implications for the baker's wife were immediate and specific. She might have been the one standing at the counter every morning, handling every transaction, knowing every customer, managing the entire commercial side of an operation that her husband's name was officially attached to. But if a dispute arose, if a customer claimed she had overcharged them, if a supplier said she had not paid what was owed, the legal action had to involve her husband, not her. She was not, in the formal legal sense, fully there. There was, however, an exception. In certain English towns, a married woman could apply for a status called feme sole trader. This was a legal recognition that she was conducting a business in her own right, independently of her husband, and that the commercial and legal consequences of that business were hers alone, not his. In London in particular, this status was recognised and applied for by women who ran specific trades, including in some cases bakers. Feme sole trader status was a workaround, a legal fiction almost that carved out a space in the coverture framework for the commercial realities that were simply too obvious to pretend away. If a woman was running a business, genuinely running it, not merely helping, then the law could in certain circumstances acknowledge that she was doing so. It was not equality. It was a concession to practical necessity. But it meant that some medieval women in English towns were operating as legally recognised business people in their own names. The widow was in many ways the freest woman in the medieval commercial world. When a master baker died, the situation of his widow was legally transformed. Because under English coverture law, a widow was a feme sole, a woman alone with her own legal identity, able to make contracts, own property, and conduct business in her own name. The covering that had obscured her was gone. Many bakers' widows continued the business. This was not unusual. It was in some cases expected the guild would sometimes specify the conditions under which a widow could continue to operate the period of time she was permitted to maintain the bakehouse, under the existing license, the circumstances under which she might take on an apprentice to help her run it. The historical records document girls being apprenticed specifically to widows running bakeries. The feminine Latin form pistorissa, female baker, appears in these apprenticeship contracts as the employer, a widow teaching a young woman the craft of bread within the formal structure of the apprenticeship system, passing on knowledge that would otherwise be lost. There is something deeply significant in this image, and I want to sit with it for a moment. Think about what it meant for that apprentice, a girl placed by her family into the care of a woman who ran a business, learning a skilled trade from a female master. In a world where most formal economic structures were organized around male authority, the widow's bakery created a space where skill transmission between women was not just acceptable, but legally formalized. It happened in the commercial heart of the town, not in domestic obscurity. It was recognized, contracted, recorded. And then, if the widow remarried, it disappeared. The new husband became the legal head. The femme sole became a femme covert again. The woman who had been a legally independent operator for a period between marriages reverted to invisibility in the eyes of the official record. This cycle was relentless. There is a moment in the legal history of medieval London that I find genuinely striking in what it reveals about how the city understood women and bread. A provision in the Liber Albus, the great compilation of London's customs and regulations assembled in 1419, notes that the faulty bread of all foreign bakers who sold in London was to be forfeited. This meant bread that did not meet the assize standards could be taken away by the authorities. What is interesting is the specific cases cited two women from outside the city, Juliana from Newington and Agnes from Stratford, who had both brought underweight bread to sell in London's markets. Both had their bread confiscated. They were not referred to as their husbands' representatives. They were named directly, Juliana from Newington, Agnes from Stratford. Individual women selling bread in their own right in the city's commercial space prosecuted under the bread regulations in their own names. They were visible to the law precisely because they had done something wrong. But their visibility tells us that they were there trading independently, operating in the market, subject to the same commercial regulations as anyone else. The woman the records notice is the woman who failed. The woman the records ignore is the one who fed the city every day without incident. Let me tell you something about the word Baxter. In medieval English, a Baxter was a female baker. The word survives today primarily as a surname. You have probably encountered it. But in the 13th and 14th centuries it was an active occupational term. A bakester or baxter was a woman who baked professionally. Not the wife of a baker, not the assistant of a baker. A baker. The existence of this word tells you something important. You do not develop specialized occupational terminology for an activity that women do not actually perform. The word Baxter exists because there were enough women baking professionally in medieval England that the language found it useful to distinguish them. Some Baxters had their own bakehouses. Others were what the records call regretresses, women who bought bread wholesale and sold it retail door to door, or from stalls in the market carrying their goods in baskets or on their heads. At the bottom of the commercial hierarchy, these women occupied the distribution end of the bread trade, connecting the baker's production to the customers who could not easily get to the bakehouse itself. This work was not glamorous. It was at the lowest rung of the trading economy. The regrettress made small margins on small quantities. She was not a guild member, had no formal standing, was subject to the kind of casual regulation and arbitrary enforcement that falls most heavily on those without institutional protection, but she was part of the supply chain. Without her, the bread that the baker produced in the dark would not have reached every corner of the town. She was the distribution network for the medieval food economy, visible every day in the market and in the streets, remembered in almost no document that was not a complaint about her being in the wrong place or selling at the wrong price. I want to end this particular thread with something that I think deserves to be said directly. The story of women in medieval bread making is not a story about extraordinary exceptions to a male-dominated world. Jeanette Barrald's naval contract is remarkable, but it is remarkable because the contract survived, not because women of her competence were rare. The widow running her own bakehouse was not exceptional. She was one of many across every town in every generation, keeping the operation alive through the transition between one male legal representative and the next. The Baxters, the regretresses, the bakers' wives who managed the selling while their husbands managed the oven, these were not peripheral figures. They were the system. They were woven into the fabric of how bread moved from production to consumption in the medieval world in roles that were structurally necessary and personally demanding, and almost entirely invisible to the records that future historians would rely on. There is a word for what they did. It is the same word we've been using all along for the men. They were bakers. The bread they made fed towns, and when those towns were threatened by armies, by famine, by the kind of collective desperation that turns ordinary social arrangements into crisis, the bread took on a different dimension entirely. Bread as currency, bread as politics, bread as the thing that could start a riot or end one. That is where we are going next, and the story there is wilder and more human and more immediately recognizable than you might expect. Somewhere around the end of the 8th century, an emperor stood before his councillors and made a declaration. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, ruler of much of Western and Central Europe, the man whose ambitions were reshaping the political map of the continent, needed to pay his soldiers, his servants, his administrators, the workers maintaining his estates, the craftsmen building his churches. He had enormous resources, vast territories, enormous quantities of grain flowing through his treasury. What he did not have in anything like sufficient quantity was coin. The great accounting exercise historians have applied to Charlemagne's financial records reveals something genuinely startling. Many of the silver amounts he recorded in his accounts as owed or paid were likely never minted at all. The coins did not exist. The figures were notional numbers in a ledger representing obligations and transfers that happened in practice, not through the exchange of metal discs but through the exchange of things. Grain, labour, bread. This was not unique to Charlemagne. It was a structural feature of the medieval economy that modern people who live in a world of bank accounts and digital transactions and credit card points find almost impossible to fully absorb. Metallic money in the medieval world was not the air it breathed. It was more like the formal suit in the back of the wardrobe brought out for specific occasions, transactions of a certain scale and formality, while the actual daily fabric of economic life was woven from exchanges in kind. What you grew, what you made, what you baked, and bread, the historian David Graeber observed in his work on the history of debt, was the closest thing many medieval workers and peasants ever came to currency. Bakers in some regions issued their own tokens, small pieces of marked leather, cut from a belt stamped with a crude seal. These scraps circulated in local economies as a form of IOU redeemable for bread, because bread was what people needed, and bread was what they trusted. Metallic coins were for merchants and lords and tax collectors. Leather tokens were for people who needed to eat. Now, I want to be careful here because the picture of a purely bread-based economy is an oversimplification. Medieval England in the 13th and 14th centuries had considerably more coin in circulation than the romantic image of a barter economy suggests. Archaeological finds of halved and quartered pennies show that small denomination coinage was being used in everyday transactions. But the fundamental point holds. Grain and bread occupied a position in the medieval economy that was structural rather than incidental. They were embedded in every transaction, every obligation, every relationship between labour and payment. Farm servants and harvest workers in medieval England were routinely paid partly in grain. This was not considered undignified. It was not a workaround for cash shortage in an otherwise monetary economy. It was the normal form of the transaction, a recognition that what the worker needed most was food, and what the employer had most readily available was grain, and that the most efficient thing was to bring these two realities together directly. When the landowners' harvest workers were paid with bread in Norfolk around the year 1300, barley bread, as we have already established, was the ordinary bread of field labourers that bread represented their wages as directly as a paycheck. When the same workers a century later were being paid with wheat bread instead, that change in grain quality was not merely a culinary improvement. It was a wage increase. The better bread was worth more, and receiving it instead of barley acknowledged that the labour being performed deserved more. This is one of the more thought-provoking aspects of the medieval bread economy that rarely makes it into popular accounts. You could track social change, economic improvement, the slow renegotiation of what labour was worth through the grain in the loaves that people were being paid with. The shift from barley to maslin to wheat in wage payments across the 13th and 14th centuries is a quiet history of workers gradually asserting that their time and effort deserved better bread, and getting it. The monastery is where this becomes most vivid and most quantified. The great English abbeys, Glastonbury, Ely, Westminster, St Albans, maintained extraordinarily detailed records of their internal economies, and these records survive in some cases with a completeness that is genuinely remarkable. They allow us to reconstruct with unusual precision how bread moved through an institution that was simultaneously a religious community, a major landowner, a hospital, a school, and an employer of hundreds of people. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed Benedictine monastic life from the 6th century onward, specified the daily bread allowance for each monk approximately £1, supplemented by other foods at the 2 daily meals. This was the baseline, the institutional commitment the abbey made to each member of its community. You will have bread every day regardless, but the abbey's bread economy extended far beyond the monks themselves. The lay servants and workers employed by the abbey received grain as part of their wages. The monks' household staff, the cooks, the grooms, the farm labourers were fed from the abbey's granaries and bakery. Visitors were fed. The sick in the abbey's hospital were fed, and then distributed at the gates or through the designated almoner. Bread was given daily to the poor who came seeking it. In some of the larger English abbeys, this distribution to the poor was not casual or occasional. It was systematic, a daily institutional commitment built into the abbey's budget and staffing that translated the abbey's grain holdings directly into social welfare for the surrounding community. The Abbey of St Albans, north of London, distributed thousands of loaves annually as alms. The bread did not stop at the monastery walls, it moved outward, in quantities that the records allow us to count. What this means is that the baker employed by a major medieval abbey, or the monastery's designated pister, as the position was sometimes called the monk, or lay specialist, whose specific responsibility was managing the baking, was not simply a craftsman producing food for his own community. He was operating the distribution mechanism for a significant portion of the local poor relief system. The bread he made was currency. The bread he made was welfare. The bread he made was in a sense that the medieval world understood entirely and that we have largely forgotten politics. Which brings us to armies. Can I ask you something? Have you ever heard the phrase, "An army marches on its stomach"? It is usually attributed to Napoleon, which is historically dubious, but makes for a good story. What is not dubious is the underlying truth, which was as apparent to Julius Caesar as it was to Henry V of England, as it is to every military commander in every period of history. The army that runs out of bread stops. Not metaphorically, literally stops. Medieval armies were not provisioned the way modern armies are, with sophisticated logistics chains and pre-positioned supply depots. Medieval armies largely fed themselves from the countryside they were moving through, which is a polite way of saying they took what they found from farmers who had no power to refuse them. But this improvised foraging had its limits, particularly during sieges or extended campaigns, and particularly in winter when the countryside had little left to take. What armies needed in quantities that foraging could not provide reliably was bread-dense, portable, sustaining bread that could keep a soldier functional for a day's march and a day's fighting. The baked form that served armies best was not fresh bread at all. Fresh bread spoiled too quickly, went mouldy in damp conditions, crumbled under the handling of a loaded wagon or a soldier's pack. What armies needed was something closer to what we discussed much earlier in this story, the twice-baked biscuit. Hardtack, buccellatum as the Romans called it, a bread so thoroughly dried that it could last for months without spoiling dense as compressed cardboard, hard enough that a soldier needed to soak it in water or wine before his teeth could address it usefully. The Roman Codex Theodosianus, a great compilation of imperial law from the late 4th century, specifies precisely what soldiers on the march should receive hardtack for 2 days' bread, on the third wine and vinegar and salted meat distributed accordingly. The alternation was practical. Hardtack for the road bread when conditions allowed. The difference was not about taste, it was about shelf life weight and the logistical reality of keeping 1,000 men fed across 100 miles. Medieval armies inherited this tradition directly. English soldiers on campaign in France received bread rations when bakers could be moved up with the army, and hardtack when they could not. The baker who followed an army and bakers did follow armies setting up field ovens as close to the front as safety allowed, was one of the most strategically valuable people in the campaign and one of the most invisible in the accounts of the battles. The baker who kept Edward III's armies in France provisioned while the great victories of Crécy and Poitiers were being won was never going to have a chronicle written about him. But without bread, the archers who ended feudal cavalry at Crécy did not shoot. Now we arrive at the most dramatic dimension of bread as politics, the riot. E.P. Thompson, one of the 20th century's great historians of English popular culture, argued in a famous essay that what historians had long dismissed as food riots, the sudden, violent explosions of popular anger centred on bread prices and bread access, were not irrational mob violence at all. They were, Thompson argued, highly structured expressions of a very specific set of moral beliefs that the crowd shared completely, and that the authorities sometimes did too. The belief was simple. There was a just price for bread. It might shift with the harvest and the seasons, but it could not, without violating an understood social contract, rise beyond the point where ordinary people could no longer afford to eat. And when bakers or grain merchants or mill owners were seen to be charging more than the just price, especially when they were hoarding grain while people went hungry nearby, or exporting food while the local population starved, the crowd had a legitimate claim in its own moral framework to intervene. This intervention was not random, it was targeted. The crowd went to the granary, the mill, the bakehouse. It demanded that stored grain be released for sale. It sometimes forced sales at the price the crowd had decided was just paying for the bread, rather than simply taking it, because taking without paying would have been theft, and what the crowd was asserting was not its right to steal, but its right to eat at a fair price. The records of medieval England describe events at Bristol, Lynn and Boston, in 1347 three-port towns where crowds removed grain from ships that were preparing to export it during a period of domestic shortage. The crowd was not taking from bakers or from people who needed to eat. It was taking from export merchants who were moving food out of an area that needed it at a moment when the crowd had decided that this was impermissible. These events were recorded by the authorities as criminal acts. The crowds who participated in them understood them as moral acts. The baker was caught in the middle of this tension in a way that was uniquely uncomfortable, because the crowd trusted the baker in the sense that the baker was visible, present, local, named. And the crowd also feared what the baker represented, the mechanism by which prices were set, and food was allocated in a way that could turn very quickly in a bad year from dependence to fury. The baker in a medieval town was the person who fed the community. He was also the person the community might turn on if it felt it was being denied its just portion. Let me tell you about the specific mechanism by which bread became political power in the medieval English town, because it is more precise than the general picture of riots and crowds might suggest. The assize of bread, which we explored in depth earlier, was not simply a price regulation. It was a social contract written in law. And one of its most politically significant provisions was this: when grain prices rose dramatically, the king, or in practice his agents, the local authorities acting in the crown's name, had the power to compel bakers to sell bread at below market prices, or even to confiscate bread for distribution to the population. This was not a casual emergency measure. It was built into the structure of the system. The medieval state understood that bread prices could become a political crisis faster than almost any other economic variable, and it reserved to itself the power to override the baker's economic interests in those moments for the sake of public order. The baker who found his morning production commandeered by royal agents paid at a price the king's men had decided was fair, rather than the price the market would have given him. That baker had no legal recourse. He had accepted in becoming a baker in an English town that the crown reserved this claim over his production. This is the same logic that positioned the baker as essential infrastructure. Infrastructure does not get to price gouge during emergencies. Infrastructure exists for the community, and in crisis moments the community calls it in. There is something I want to sit with here before we move forward. Think about how many dimensions bread occupied simultaneously in the medieval world. It was nutrition, obviously. The calories that kept people alive. It was currency, the thing in which wages were paid. Rent was sometimes settled, charity was dispensed, and the complex web of obligations that constituted medieval economic life was partially satisfied. It was political power, the substance over which riots erupted, over which kings legislated, over which armies moved and stopped. It was social identity, the type you ate, the whiteness or darkness of the crumb, the fineness of the flour announcing your place in the world to every person who saw your table. It was religious meaning, the communion bread at the centre of Christian worship, the lammas loaf blessed on the first harvest of August, the charitable loaves distributed at funerals and feast days as acts of prayer, as much as acts of generosity. And underneath all of this, producing it every morning before the sun rose invisible in every dimension, except the consequences of his absence, was the baker. He did not think of himself as managing all of these dimensions simultaneously. He was making bread. He was managing flour and fire and time and weight, and the expectations of people who would be at his counter in a few hours. But what he was actually doing every day was holding a particular kind of civilization together. We have talked about almost everything now: the craft, the law, the fraud, the guild, the women, the politics. There is one chapter left in the baker's story that we have been building toward since the very beginning. The chapter about what happened when things went truly wrong. When the harvest failed not just badly but catastrophically. When the bread that the town needed was simply not there. How the baker survived a famine. What it cost him. What it cost everyone around him. And whether in the end the system that had been built so carefully over centuries was strong enough to hold, when the most fundamental thing it depended on, the grain in the fields, simply did not appear. That is exactly where we are going. August the 10th, 1315. King Edward II of England is travelling with his royal household, making the kind of progress through his realm that English monarchs made, regularly visiting abbeys and monasteries, receiving hospitality, conducting the business of governance through presence and movement rather than through a fixed court. His entourage is large, his expectations are the expectations of a king, and tonight he has stopped at the Abbey of St Albans just north of London, and the Abbey of St Albans cannot provide him with bread. This is worth dwelling on. The Abbey of St Albans was one of the great monastic institutions of medieval England. It was wealthy. It had granaries. It had bakers. It had been feeding its own monks, its servants, its guests, and the poor at its gates for centuries. An English king stopping here for a night was an occasion it had managed before and would manage again. But on this particular night, in this particular summer, there was almost no bread to be found. The chronicler Johannes de Trochelauer, a Benedictine monk who recorded the events of that year with the kind of granular honesty that makes medieval chronicles so valuable, wrote that the land was so oppressed with want that it was hardly possible to find bread to supply the king's immediate household. Hardly possible to find bread for the king, in the richest kingdom in England, in one of the best provisioned monasteries in the country. If that is what it was like for Edward II, consider what it was like for everyone else. The Great Famine began, as most catastrophes do, with weather. In the autumn and winter of 1314 it rained, and kept raining in a way that went beyond the ordinary miserable dampness of an English autumn, into something that farmers who had been watching weather their entire lives recognized with a particular cold dread as wrong. The fields flooded. Crops that should have been harvested rotted in standing water. Livestock died. The grain that had been stored from the previous year, the reserves that normally carried a community through the gap between harvest and harvest, began to run out or go mouldy in conditions too wet to keep anything dry or to be consumed by a population that had nothing left to replace it with. And then 1315 arrived, and it rained again. The summer of 1315 was cold and wet from beginning to end. The grain that had been planted in spring, sown with the desperate optimism that this year had to be better, it could not possibly be as bad as last year, failed to ripen in the cold and the damp. The return on seed planted was in some regions 1 grain for every 2 sown, which means the farmers ended the summer with less grain than they had started it with. This was not a bad harvest. A bad harvest is disappointing. This was a harvest that left communities worse off after working all season than they had been before they started. This is the kind of arithmetic that breaks a civilization. Wheat prices in England had stood at approximately 5 shillings for a quarter measure in the relatively normal year of 1313. By early 1315 they had risen to 20 shillings. By high summer of 1315, as the scale of the disaster became undeniable, they reached 40 shillings, 8 times the price of grain in the space of 2 years. Johannes de Trochelauer wrote of that summer that meat and eggs began to run out, capons and fowl could hardly be found. Animals died of disease, swine could not be fed because of the excessive price of fodder. In Lorraine in France, cereal grain prices rose by 320%. In France as a whole, the price of cereal increased by what historians have estimated at around 800%. And then 1316 arrived, and it rained again. I want to tell you about what this looked like from the inside of a bakehouse, because the standard narrative of the Great Famine focuses understandably on the large-scale mortality, the 10 to 15% of the English population estimated to have died, the 5 to 12% of the population of Northern Europe, the total losses across the continent that represent millions of people lost in less than 5 years. These numbers are correct and important and genuinely staggering. But there was also a specific person in a specific building on a specific street in a specific English town trying to do the thing he had done every morning of his working life, trying to bake bread for the people who needed it with flour that was becoming impossible to obtain at any price he could translate back into a loaf that his customers could afford. Think about what the baker's situation actually was. His costs had multiplied by a factor of 8. The assize of bread, as we have established, required him to adjust the weight of his loaf in response to grain price changes, making smaller loaves rather than charging more. At 5 shillings a quarter, the legal weight for the farthing loaf of best white bread was around 2.5 kilograms. As wheat hit 40 shillings, the legal weight had fallen to something closer to 120 grams. The formula adjusted. The law adjusted. What the law could not adjust was the question of whether wheat was available at any price, because there is a stage in a supply crisis where money simply stops being a solution. 40 shillings will buy you a quarter of wheat if a quarter of wheat exists somewhere within reach, and someone is willing to sell it. But if the fields flooded and the crop rotted and the grain merchants have nothing in their warehouses, and the lords have locked their granaries, and what little is available is being fought over in markets that have turned violent, 40 shillings does not buy you anything. The baker who had invested everything in his oven, his tools, his apprentices, his supply relationships, his long-standing arrangements with the miller and the grain merchant, in the worst months of 1315 and 1316, he was standing in a building full of equipment he could not use in a town full of people who desperately needed what he was supposed to produce, and he had nothing to bake with. What did bakers actually do? The historical record is partial and uneven, but we can piece together the range of responses. Some bakers acquired whatever grain was available regardless of type, regardless of quality, and made what they could from it. The bread of the famine years was not the bread of normal years. It was made from oats, previously cattle fodder, mixed with whatever else could be found. In the worst periods it incorporated peas, beans, acorns, dried chestnuts, the ground roots of plants that had never been intended as bread ingredients. Pliny the Elder had written centuries earlier that people in times of scarcity would dry acorns, grind them into flour, and knead them into what he called bread. Medieval people knew this. The knowledge of emergency substitutions was part of the cultural inheritance of every community that had ever gone hungry, which was every community. When the normal flour disappeared, the baker reached for what remained. Acorn flour is bitter. It requires extensive processing, leaching with water to remove the tannins before it produces anything edible. The bread it makes is dense, dark, gummy in texture, with an astringent quality that normal palates find deeply unpleasant. But deeply unpleasant bread is better than no bread, and in 1315 and 1316 deeply unpleasant bread was what some bakers made, because it was what the materials allowed. The Benedictine chronicler who wrote about the famine noted that people had begun to harvest wild edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark from the forests. He wrote this as evidence of extreme deprivation because it was, but it was also in a quieter way evidence of resilience. People knew what the forest contained. They knew which roots could be rendered edible and which could not. They knew the hard-won emergency knowledge that civilization stores in its folk memory for exactly the moments when the official food supply fails. The baker working with these materials was no longer practicing his craft. He was practicing survival. He was taking whatever could possibly be turned into something edible and doing his best to make it into something people could eat. Here is a detail from the famine records that I've thought about more than almost anything else in this entire story. Some communities in 1315 and 1316, driven by the particular desperation of people who have exhausted every other option, ate their seed grain. Seed grain. The grain kept back from the harvest specifically to plant in the following spring, the single most essential input for next year's crop. The thing that if you consumed it means there is no next year's harvest, means the cycle breaks at its most fundamental point. They ate it anyway, because when you're watching your children starve, the abstract calculation about next spring's harvest is not the calculation your body makes. The calculation your body makes is there is grain, and there is hunger, and the grain is here, and the hunger is now. The communities that ate their seed grain in the winter of 1315 to 1316 were in a very real sense consuming their future, and they knew it, and they did it anyway. The Chronicle of Lanercost records the conclusion of what it had witnessed with a kind of exhausted restraint. Such a mortality of men in England and Scotland through famine and pestilence as had not been heard of in our time. Not heard of in our time. This was a generation that was accustomed to hardship, that had lived through difficult winters and poor harvests before, that had inherited the memory of previous famines from the generations before them, and even by that standard, even measured against the accumulated experience of a culture that knew very well what hunger looked like. What happened in 13, 15, 16 and 17 was something new. The baker who survived these years, and many did, the mortality devastating as it was still left the majority alive, emerged with something that is very difficult to adequately describe. He had been tested in a way that his craft under normal conditions was never designed to withstand. He had practiced his trade with materials that were not the materials of his trade. He had made decisions every morning in conditions of genuine scarcity that made the ordinary pressures of the assize and the guild and the grain merchant look almost comfortable by comparison. And he had kept the oven lit. Not always, not everyone. There were bakers who closed their doors in the worst months who had nothing to bake with and no access to anything that could substitute. There were bakers who went hungry themselves, who couldn't afford the grain at 40 shillings any more than the labourer at the door with his penny could afford the bread. But many kept the oven lit, because the alternative, the town without a baker, the morning without bread, the visible, undeniable failure of the most basic civic function, was too important to allow. I am not romanticising this. It was not heroic in any consciously performed sense. It was more like the particular stubbornness of people who have built their identity around a specific useful thing and cannot quite bring themselves to stop doing it, even when all the conditions for doing it well have been stripped away. He kept the oven lit because he was a baker. There is something that the Great Famine did to the European world that is worth pausing to name because it connects the baker's story to a much larger arc of history. The famine of 1315 to 1317 was followed almost immediately, historically speaking, by the Great Bovine Pestilence, a cattle disease that wiped out 60% of the livestock on the European continent between roughly 1318 and the early 1320s. Salt prices had already quadrupled during the famine because wet weather had prevented the evaporation of brine in the coastal salt pans, making it nearly impossible to preserve the meat and fish that might otherwise have substituted for bread. And then 25 years later came the Black Death. Historians have noted that the populations entering the plague years of 1346 to 1353 were not the same populations that had entered the famine years of 1315. They had been weakened. Their reserves, physical, nutritional, social, institutional, had been depleted and not fully rebuilt. The malnutrition of the famine years had affected immune systems' bone density, the developmental health of children who grew up hungry and were now adults facing a pandemic. The Great Famine was not just a disaster in itself. It was the first blow in a sequence of blows that would reshape European society so completely that the world that emerged from the 14th century would be in important ways unrecognizable to the people who had entered it. The baker standing at his oven in 1315 working with acorn flour and bean paste had no way of knowing that the decades to come would be worse. He only knew that today was already unlike anything his training had prepared him for, and that tomorrow the town would still need bread, and that he was the person who had to provide it. Do you ever think about what your threshold is? The point at which you would stop. I don't mean that dramatically. I just mean there is something in the story of people who kept doing the essential thing when the conditions for doing it well were gone, who kept showing up to the work when the work had become almost unrecognizable, something in that story that I find genuinely moving. The medieval baker at the height of the famine was not producing what he would have called bread. He knew the difference. He had been trained to know the difference. He had spent 7 years learning what good bread was and how to make it. What he was producing was something that kept people alive, which may in the end be a better definition of bread than any of the technical ones. We are coming to the end of this story now. But before we close, there is one more extraordinary thread to pull, the thread that connects everything we've been talking about: the oven, the flour, the law, the guild, the famine to the world you're sitting in right now. The bread bakers of the medieval world left their traces in the language you speak every day, in the words you use without thinking, in the phrases that have been living in the English language for so long that they have forgotten where they came from. That final chapter, the words and phrases and concepts that were born in a medieval bakehouse and are still alive in your conversations 8 centuries later, is exactly where we are going. Here is a sentence you probably said recently in some form without thinking twice. Maybe you described someone's idea as half-baked. Maybe you told a friend you needed to earn some dough. Maybe you called someone your companion, or referred to a colleague as your company for the evening. Maybe in a moment of cultural commentary about wealth or privilege you used the phrase upper crust. Or perhaps you walked into a room called a pantry, opened a cupboard with food that came in a pan, ate a panini, read about a pandemic and understood intuitively why it was named that way. Every one of those words, every single one, carries the fingerprints of the medieval bakehouse, not metaphorically, etymologically, in the specific traceable documented history of how these sounds came to mean what they mean in the English language today. There is a direct line back to the people who worked with grain and fire and stone in the centuries we have been exploring together. And I think before we close this story, we should spend some time with that. Because it is one thing to understand the medieval baker as a historical figure, a person in a specific time and place doing a specific job. It is another thing entirely to realize that his world is still speaking to you right now through the words in your mouth. Let us start with the one that I find genuinely beautiful, because it is not just about bread. It is about what bread meant in human relationships. The word companion. It comes from the late Latin compagno, which appears for the first time in a 6th century document called the Frankish Lex Salica, the law code of the Frankish people, who were the forebears of what would become France. The Latin word compagno is a compound com meaning with or together and panis meaning bread. A companion in the original sense of the word was someone you ate bread with, not someone you liked, not someone you had known a long time, someone you sat at a table with and shared the bread. That was the criterion. That was the bond. The word appears to have been a Latin translation of a Germanic concept. The Gothic word Gehleiber, literally with bread person, appears to have been the source that the Latin was calquing, which means that the idea predates even the late Latin. It was embedded in the Germanic tribal cultures that would eventually produce English, an understanding that the deepest form of social connection was expressed through the act of breaking bread with someone. Strangers become companions by eating together. The literal mechanics of that transformation, sitting at the same table, sharing from the same loaf, accepting food from the same hands, was the original definition of the word. Think about how many times you've used the word companion to mean simply a close friend, someone you trust, someone whose presence you value. The Latin root has been worn smooth by 8 centuries of casual use, its bread origins rubbed away by repetition. But they are still there. Every time you call someone your companion, you are etymologically calling them someone you've broken bread with. And from companion came company, a group of companions, literally a gathering of people who shared bread together. The army unit called a company, the business organization called a company, the theatrical company that stages plays. All of them at their etymological root are gatherings of bread sharers. Now we move from the beautiful to the practical, the word pantry. Its Latin root is panetaria, from panis bread, and it originally meant the room where bread was stored and the servant who was in charge of it. The panetier, as the position was called in medieval French, was a specific household official whose job was the management of the bread supply, ordering it, receiving it, storing it, serving it at the appropriate moment to the appropriate people. In a grand medieval household, this was not a minor role. The panetier was responsible for one of the most socially loaded objects in the entire house. He knew which bread went to whom. He managed the hierarchy of the table through the hierarchy of the loaf. Over centuries, pantry evolved from meaning the bread room to meaning any food storage room. The bread connection faded from common awareness as the word drifted into its modern usage. Today your pantry might contain pasta, canned beans, coffee and breakfast cereal, none of which would have been recognizable to the medieval panetier. But the room itself still bears the name of the man who managed the Lord's bread supply. The word panel also comes from panis, specifically from the early sense of a flat piece, like a flat piece of bread. And companion, as we established, gave us company and a company. The word pantomime has its root in the same Latin family via a different path through the concept of all-encompassing mime or gesture. But the pan prefix carried its own resonances. The Latin panis spread across languages in ways that still structure how people talk about bread everywhere on earth. Spanish pan, Italian pain, French pain, Portuguese po, which travelled to Japan with Portuguese missionaries and traders in the 16th century and became pan, the Japanese word for bread, which is why Japanese bread is still called pan today. One Latin word distributed across centuries and continents, still alive in a dozen languages simultaneously. The words that come from the experience of baking specifically, rather than just from the word bread, are a different kind of interesting. Half-baked. The phrase dates in its literal bread meaning to the 14th century. In Middle English, bread that was half-baken was bread that had not been baked long enough, either taken out too soon or put into an oven that was not hot enough to do the job properly. The result was bread that looked reasonable on the outside perhaps, but was raw and gummy at the centre, structurally inadequate for eating, fundamentally incomplete despite appearing to be finished. By the early 17th century, the phrase had made the jump to describing people and ideas. A half-baked plan was one that seemed to have a form but lacked the internal structure to hold up. A half-baked person was one who appeared developed but was somehow still raw at the centre, lacking the thoroughness of proper completion. The metaphor was obvious enough to anyone who had ever stood at a medieval oven. You could not rush bread. The falling oven had its own timeline, and if you pulled the loaves before that timeline was complete, you produced something that was a failure wearing success's clothing. The outward brown crust, the apparently finished shape, none of it compensated for what had not happened on the inside. An old saying from Cornwall recorded in the 19th century describes a foolish person as someone who was only half-baked, put in with the bread and taken out with the cakes, which is both cruel and quite precise, the implication being that the person was removed from the oven too early when the temperature had already dropped for the cake batch, and therefore never received the heat required for proper formation. I find this vivid enough to feel almost unkind to quote, but it is accurate. Upper crust. We touched on this very briefly in an earlier part of this story, but the phrase deserves its full examination because it is one of the most elegant examples of how a specific physical reality of medieval bread production became embedded in the English language as a metaphor for social class. The medieval oven, as we've explored in some detail, was a stone chamber heated from within by burning wood, the embers swept out before the bread went in. The floor of that chamber, no matter how carefully the baker worked, retained traces of ash from the fire, ash that the bread sat in during baking, ash that could not be entirely swept clean before every single batch. The bottom of the loaf lying directly against the oven floor picked up that ash. A thin grey-black residue on the underside of an otherwise perfect loaf. Not harmful, not inedible, but unpleasant, and visually impure in a world that associated whiteness with purity and quality. In a great household, the lord at the head of the table would not be served the bottom of his loaf. His carver, the trained servant whose specific role was to present bread correctly, would slice off the lower crust, the ashy under portion, before presenting the clean upper surface to his master. The upper crust of the loaf was the crust that the lord received. White uncontaminated, the pure top surface of bread at its best. The lower crust was cut away and given to lesser members of the household. By the early 19th century, upper crust had made the transition from describing the surface of a loaf to describing the upper surface of society. The aristocracy, the wealthy, the well-born, the upper crust. Those who received the clean top of the loaf while others ate the bottom. The metaphor was fully alive by 1835, and it has never stopped being used. Dough, money, cash, the thing you need to keep the operation running. The word dough in English, the actual substance from which bread is made, comes from the Old English dag, which is related to Germanic roots, meaning something kneaded, something worked by hand. The Old English word for the money sense of dough does not exist, obviously. That meaning is a much more recent development. The Oxford English Dictionary's earlier citation for dough meaning money is from an 1851 American college publication, where someone references getting sufficient dough to get out of a financial difficulty. But the reasoning behind the slang is older than the slang itself. Bread was livelihood. The word breadwinner, the person who earns the family's keep, appears in English print by 1821. The connection between bread and the ability to sustain life had been embedded in the language since at least the early 18th century, when Daniel Defoe in Robinson Crusoe used "seeking my bread" to mean seeking one's livelihood. The step from bread as livelihood to bread as money was a short one for a culture that had always understood bread as the fundamental economic unit. And once that step was taken, dough, the raw material of bread, the thing that becomes bread when heat is properly applied, followed naturally. Dough is money before it has fully become what it was meant to be, which is, when you think about it, a rather apt description of cash. There is also lurking nearby in the etymological landscape the Cockney rhyming slang bread and honey, contracted to bread meaning money. The rhyming slang developed in 19th century London in the same communities that had always bought their bread from bakers, operating under rules that stretched back to the 13th century. Even in the slang of the working class, bread circled back to the economic realities it had always represented. Now I want to tell you about something that connects the bakehouse to one of the most emotionally charged words in human experience. The word lord, as we established much earlier, comes from the Old English hlafword bread guardian, the word lady from hlafdig bread kneader. These we have covered. But there is another word more recent in its development that belongs in this same conversation, the word sandwich. It is not medieval. It enters the English language in the 18th century, named after John Montagu, the 4th Earl of Sandwich, who was said, probably apocryphally but enduringly, to have asked his servants to bring him meat between slices of bread so he could eat without leaving the card table. The story was recorded by a French writer in 1765, just over a decade after Montagu's supposed innovation. What is interesting about sandwich is not the story, which may be largely invented, but what it reveals about the trajectory of bread in the English-speaking mind. By the 18th century, bread had become so ordinary, so completely embedded in daily life, that a new way of using it could generate a new word named after a specific person and place. The food itself was too familiar to need naming. It was the configuration, the filling between the slices, that required a term. In medieval England, bread had been the centre of the meal, the thing everything else supported. By the 18th century, bread had become the container. It had been demoted from protagonist to vehicle, which was either a loss of status or such a complete achievement of ubiquity that it had become invisible. I'm not sure which reading is more interesting. Possibly both are true. Here is a question worth sitting with before we move to the final section of this story. How many words in your daily vocabulary carry this kind of history? How many times a day do you say something that is at its root a fossil of the medieval world, a compressed record of how people lived, what they valued, what they feared, what they understood about the relationship between food and survival and community? Language is full of these compressed records. Most of them are invisible most of the time. We speak without archaeology, without excavating the roots of the words we use. But the bread words are particularly vivid, I think, because bread itself was so central, so structurally important to how medieval civilization worked, that it left impressions everywhere, in the law, in the guild records, in the court documents with their specific fines for underweight wastrels, in the chronicles of famines and floods, in the paintings and manuscript illuminations that show women with their long paddles at stone ovens, and in the language itself, in the words we carry forward without knowing where they came from. Every time you call someone your companion, you are completing a linguistic act that was first performed by a 6th century Frankish writer, trying to capture in Latin what it meant to share a loaf with someone you trusted. Every time you talk about earning a crust, you are speaking from the perspective of the labourer who received the bottom of the loaf and knew exactly what that meant. Every time you say something is half-baked, you are invoking the knowledge of a craftsman who understood in his body what happened when heat and time were insufficient. All of this, the words, the law, the famine, the guild, the women, the oven, the fraud, the currency, the armies, flows back to one person, standing in the dark before the town woke up feeding a fire. We are almost at the end of this story now. But there is one more thing I want to give you before we close. A final perspective on the baker's legacy that pulls everything together into something that surprised even me when I found it, because the medieval baker's influence did not end with the medieval world. The systems he operated within, the regulations, the standards, the understanding that a community has a collective stake in the food that feeds it, did not simply disappear when the world changed around them. They transformed, they evolved, they became the foundations of food regulation as we know it today. And that final thread from the assize of bread to the first food safety laws from the guild inspection to the modern regulatory state from one baker in 13th century London to the labelled loaf on your kitchen counter right now is exactly where we finish. 1646. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, barely 16 years old, raw and precarious, carved out of a wilderness that the settlers still only partially understood, the General Court passed a law about bread, not about land grants, not about relations with indigenous peoples, not about the governance structures of a new society forming itself in real time on the edge of a continent. Bread. Specifically, an assize of bread regulating the weight, price and quality of loaves sold in the colony. The language was borrowed almost directly from the English statute that had governed bread in the old country for nearly 4 centuries. The same sliding scale between grain prices and loaf weights. The same principle that the price stayed fixed while the loaf adjusted. The same fundamental conviction that bread was too important, too structurally necessary to the community's daily survival to be left entirely to the mechanisms of the free market. 400 years after Henry III's officials first codified it into English law, the colonists who had crossed an ocean and built something new in a new world still reach for the same framework when they needed to answer the question, how do we make sure the bread is what it is supposed to be? The answer had not changed. And I think that fact tells us something important about what the medieval baker built. The assize of bread and ale is formally listed in the FDA's own historical documentation as the first food law in the lineage that eventually produced the United States Food and Drug Administration. the agency that today regulates roughly 1/4 of all consumer products sold in the United States, the drugs you take, the food your family eats. The medical devices that keep people alive traces its regulatory ancestry directly to the 13th century law that was promulgated because English towns needed a reliable mechanism to prevent their bakers from selling underweight bread. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which is the foundational legislation from which the FDA grew, was in the same tradition, a public recognition that certain commodities are too essential, and the information asymmetry between producers and consumers too significant to leave safety and honesty to individual negotiation. The consumer who buys a loaf of bread cannot test each one before purchase. The consumer who buys a medicine cannot independently assess its contents. Someone has to stand in that gap with authority and accountability on behalf of the people who depend on what is being sold. That someone in the 13th century was the guild inspector with his standardized scales. Today it is a federal agency with laboratories and enforcement powers that span 50 states. The technology has changed beyond recognition. The principle is the same. There is a baker's mark detail I want to tell you about because it connects the medieval world to the modern one in a way that is almost too neat to believe. Under the assize of bread, bakers in medieval England were required to mark their loaves, not simply to shape them distinctively, though that happened too, but to apply a specific identifier, a baker's mark, that made it possible to trace any loaf back to the person who had made it. This was accountability made physical. If a bread inspector found a loaf that was underweight, the mark on the bread told him exactly whose oven it had come from. There was no ambiguity, no plausible deniability. The loaf carried its maker's identity as directly as a signature carries the writer's hand. In the food system of the 21st century, we call this traceability. It is one of the most important concepts in modern food safety regulation. When there is a contamination event, when a batch of lettuce turns out to be carrying a dangerous pathogen, when a processed food product has to be recalled from shelves across the country, the question that regulators ask immediately is, where did this come from? Who made it? Which facility? Which batch number? The ability to answer that question quickly and accurately is what allows a targeted recall rather than a general panic. It is what lets authorities pull the specific contaminated product without shutting down an entire industry. And the principle that food must be traceable to its maker, that the producer must be identifiable from the product, is something that the medieval baker was required to practice with his simple bread mark in 13th century London. The sophistication has changed. The principle is 800 years old. Now I want to step back from the regulatory lineage for a moment because I think there is something even larger at stake here, something that the baker's story illuminates about the way we organize ourselves as communities, about what we owe each other, and about what we are willing to enforce. The medieval world understood bread regulation as a moral issue, not just a commercial one. The baker who sold underweight bread was not simply committing an economic infraction. He was breaking faith with the community that depended on him. The punishments, the hurdle through the streets, the pillory, the oven destruction were designed to convey exactly that. You were not fined for an accounting error. You were publicly shamed for a violation of a shared social contract. E.P. Thompson, the great 20th century historian, argued that the food riots of pre-industrial Europe expressed what he called a moral economy, a set of understood obligations about what the community owed its members and what its members owed each other in return. The rioters who forced bakers to sell at what they considered a just price were not acting irrationally. They were asserting a right that the community had collectively recognized for centuries, the right to eat at a price that a person's labor could reach. That moral economy is not entirely gone. It lives in the minimum wage debates, in the healthcare coverage arguments, in the conversations about housing costs in cities where working people can no longer afford to live. The specific commodity has changed from bread to a basket of contemporary necessities. The underlying argument that some things are too essential to human survival to be allocated purely by market mechanism has not changed at all. The medieval baker was at the centre of that argument. In some ways, he still is. Let me bring you back one final time to where this story began. It is before dawn, a town is asleep, and somewhere near the centre of that town, in a stone building set slightly apart from its neighbours, a fire is being lit. Everything we have covered over these hours together, the ergot fungus in the rye, the banal rites of the French lords, the trapdoor in John Brid's kneading table, the iron bars in the loaves, the falling oven, and its descending sequence of heat, the baker's dozen born from legal anxiety, the great famine, and the king who could not find bread at St. Albans, the word companion hiding its bread-sharing origin in plain sight, the brown bakers who lost to the white bakers because the market preferred the less nutritious product, the widow running her bakehouse as a femme sole Jeannette Barral, signing a contract with the Royal Navy of France. All of it radiates outward from this one moment. A person, a fire, flour water, and time. The medieval baker did not think of himself as making history. He thought of himself as making bread. The distinction to him would probably have seemed unnecessary. The bread was the history. The bread was the politics and the economics and the gender dynamics and the legal philosophy and the linguistic legacy, all of it folded together and shaped by practiced hands and placed into a stone oven. What he left behind was not a monument or a name. He left behind a legal tradition that travelled across an ocean to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and eventually, through several centuries of transformation, became the regulatory framework that keeps the food on your table safe. He left behind words companion pantry upper crust half-baked dough that still carry his world's logic in their etymological bones. He left behind an understanding of what community means that is in its essence, the same understanding we're still arguing about today, that some things are held in common, that some obligations cannot be entirely privatized, that the person who feeds the town has a relationship with the town that goes deeper than simple commerce. He left behind the idea that bread is not just food. It never was. I've been thinking throughout this long story about what it means to be essential, not famous, not powerful, not remembered in chronicles or celebrated in monuments, just necessary, the thing without which nothing else works. The medieval baker was essential in that specific unglamorous way. He did not choose it. He trained for it. He worked for it. He was regulated and fined and sometimes publicly humiliated for it. He got up before everyone else and went to bed after the first work was done and did it again the next morning without being asked, and without being thanked, and without in most cases being recorded. And yet, when Edward II of England stopped at St. Albans on August the 10th, 1315, and the chronicler noted with plain astonishment that there was almost no bread to be found for the king himself, what that moment recorded without intending to was how high the baker's absence rose in the structure of things. When the ordinary miracle failed to happen, everyone noticed. The bread that was always there was the baker who was always there. Before you drift off tonight, I want to leave you with one image. Somewhere in England, in the middle of the 13th century, before sunrise on an ordinary morning, a baker was pulling the first loaves out of his oven. He did not know that 8 centuries later someone would be telling his story to listeners falling asleep in their warm beds. He could not have imagined the technology that would make such a thing possible, let alone the world those listeners lived in. The distance between his life and yours is genuinely enormous in comfort, in security, in access, in everything that the accumulated labour of centuries has made possible. But the loaves came out of the oven, still hot, still crackling as they cooled, still carrying that particular smell that reaches something old in the human nervous system and says without words, we are safe today. He kept the oven lit. And somewhere in you, in the way you talk, in the words you use, in the laws that protect what you eat, in the assumption you make every morning when you reach for bread without thinking about it, some trace of what he did is still alive. That is not nothing. That is everything. Thank you. Truly, genuinely thank you for spending this time with the bakers of the medieval world, for staying through the ergot and the iron bars and the falling oven and the great famine, for being the kind of listener who finds history meaningful not because it is distant, but because it turns out to be surprisingly close. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about the baker in the dark, or the word companion, or Jeanette Barral and her naval contract, or the widow running her bakehouse between marriages, please leave a comment and tell me which part reached you most. I read them, every one, and they matter. If someone in your life would enjoy falling asleep to history that is real and human, and full of the kind of detail that textbooks leave out, share this with them. The best thing you can give another person is a story that makes the past feel inhabited. And when the next story is ready, and it is coming, I promise I hope you will be here. Until then, take good care of yourselves. Good night.